type of program. That just changed my train of thought. Sorry, our system wasn't working the way it worked last week, so we had to figure out a new way around it. But we got that all sorted out, so we can go ahead and get started. Another bit of housekeeping, please be sure to put your, for those attendees that are online, please be sure to change your name. You can rename yourself to have your first and last name so that we have a proper list of attendees to provide for the continuing education units. And with that, Chris, you can go ahead and share results. Just come back here. Okay, so we wanted to focus a little bit and opening this presentation with a little bit about our funding and programs that the Resource Conservation District can assist with. And so the Resource Conservation District is a local agency that is in place to assist our landowners, farmers, ranchers in accessing programs and supporting agriculture and other type of resource concerns. So we do have community programs. They've been working with some partners on a community garden site. They work with UC Merced on a river education day. They have upcoming volunteer plantings for monarch habitat. They currently have a repairing restoration site where they've replanted along the Merced River and have current permits to do some additional restoration and removing a rendo along Merced River. On the agricultural program side, they have officially started a carbon farm planning where they can come out and do a complete conservation plan for your farm or ranch based on carbon sequestration and reduction of greenhouse gases. They will have a pollinator hedgerow demonstration site at Merced Junior College that producers would be able to come out, and we hope to have an educational workshop on having those at your farm or ranch. Rainey is currently in training for starting a mobile irrigation lab where they'll be able to come out and do irrigation evaluations and doing these type of workshops on their own without the support of East Stanislaus, but we are happy to assist in that. We've been cooperating together on putting together an equipment rental program because we found some of the barriers to implementing some of the conservation practices is the availability of the equipment. And then of course it all comes down to conservation planning to address your resource concerns on your farm and ranch. They currently have funding through CDFA to assist with sweep applications and regional conservation partnership program, which you'll hear more about from American Farmers Trust. So this all kind of what got the East Merced RCD really up and going was several years ago during the previous drought. The Nature Conservancy used Merced County as a pilot on the value of conservation planning for resiliency. And so that was for drought resiliency, but it also brought in the ideas of carbon farm planning and restoration and a lot of the different practices that could be implemented to improve the soil conservation and water conservation on ag lands. So for the mobile irrigation lab, this is a program that Rainey is in training for, where we go out and do a full assessment of your irrigation system. Again, this all came about because of the drought resiliency studies in 2014, where funding started to become more available to resource conservation districts and other partners to provide those irrigation evaluations at no charge to the farms and ranches. So what we're looking at in those is the distribution uniformity, the flow uniformity, the irrigation scheduling, and a full report with support documents. That includes soil report with your soil profile. It includes looking up your specs for your equipment to make sure that you are getting the most value for your dollar using those irrigation systems. and using your water as efficiently as possible. So, and believe it or not, we have come across some pretty significant problems out in the field that when you're probably doing it, you're not thinking anything of it. Example is a field that was replacing their emitters with whatever they picked up at the shop, and they had a mix of emitters out in the field, which was really drastically affecting their uniformity. And when you affect your uniformity, then you're ultimately having to put more water on your field to reach your irrigation needs. So with that, we started doing the maintenance and assessments and trainings and doing workshops and in-field trainings, and then that's where Rainey has stepped in and starting to learn the ropes on how to do all of these. And so these are just a few fun pictures of the various projects the East Merced RCD has been able to do over the years. They've done a lot of work with the Wildlife Refuge, a lot of educational outreach groups, the River Education Day. They do have kayaks to be able to go out on Merced River to do. They've done everything from just education days to training for, I think it's the Sierra Conservancy, kayak trainings, UC Merced, at Yosemite Lake. Trying to remember some of the ones off the top of my head. So they've come in quite handy, some wildlife surveys to do bird counts and whatnot along the river. So a great resource that the RCD has been able to secure. Conservation planning is key, and so they have been working with various farms and ranches. The one to the right is a picture of some data collection they were doing out at a ranch in La Grande to put together the information needed for a carbon farmland. And all of this is a lot of the drive for people who have contacted the Resource Conservation District is they want to have sustainability for their farm or ranch for their next generation. But a lot of these programs, because the RCDs are not limited to existing programs, for example, one of our key partners is the USDA NRCS, but they are limited to just their existing EQIP and other programs. But what we have found is trying to get farms and ranches ready for the next available funding for them. So market access, whether it's a processor requirement, a buyer requirement, a certification that they need to access a specific marketplace, future market access. So there is in the works an ecosystem marketplace and a carbon exchange marketplace. And so those carbon farm plans or maybe a habitat conservation plan for your farm or ranch would give you access to these additional fundings for your farm or ranch. And then of course, using existing traditional programs to fund for farm improvements, whether that's infrastructure or something to increase your yields and decrease your costs. So as I mentioned, the East Merced RCD did recently receive a CDFA grant to assist with applications. Those application window just opened October 19th. And so the RCD will be able to help facilitate the technical assistance from everything from the application process all the way through to the implementation and reporting process. So and this is funding to help implement anything that's water or energy conservation related. So if you need to upgrade an old diesel pump to an electrical pump, if you need to add a variable frequency drive to your irrigation system to help make it more energy efficient, those types of, or of course the ones that are popular is converting from flood to micro or drip systems. And all that is funded by the CDFA Climate Smart Agriculture. So they also have funding to do monarch and pollinator habitat. So they are currently working on demonstration sites and training. That is going to be at the Merced Junior College. I believe they have a planting date, a volunteer planting date for the initial start of those hedgerows and pollinator habitats for November 13th. So if you're interested, I'm sure Rainey has flyers for that event where you can sign up for the newsletter to receive more information. That is funded by Xerces Society, but there is also money available through CDFA Fish and Wildlife in partnership with East Merced and East Stanislaus to do additional sites in the future. So, and we really, as RCDs, we really work hard to work with our partners, our neighbors, across the board. So again, the CDFA sweep, we're not able, for the things that we're not able to do with our own staff, we have partnerships with, say, American Farmland Trust or Stanislaus RCD or other programs that can assist. CDFA Healthy Soils Program, the Almond Board of California Sustainability Program. That one requires that you have an irrigation evaluation done once every 3 years. If you want to be at the top tier of their sustainability program, you have to have one done every year. So we are able to help with that. Department of Water Resources and Department of Conservation also funds various conservation programs. So, and I had mentioned USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service is one of the key partners. They do a lot of funding through various programs. EQIP, possibly several in the room are familiar with that one. If you've worked with NRCS at all. They also have other programs, the Conservation Stewardship Program and Conservation Incentive Program. Those are 5-year programs that work with you to improve the practices that you may already be doing. And then the newest one is a Regional Conservation Partnership Program. And again, American Farmland Trust will talk more about this. But this is a program that's going to be open to just our 5 counties in the San Joaquin Valley. So Stanislaus, Merced, Madera, Fresno, and Tulare counties are the only ones going to have access to this RCPP funding. So those other fundings are usually a statewide funding pool. So, and that's a result of the RCDs working together again with our partners to make sure that our farms and ranches are getting the assistance that they need. So with that as a quick introduction to your RCD and what we have been attempting to do for our farms and ranches. And so hopefully if you've heard of anything that might be of interest to your farm or ranch, you can reach out to Ursula or Rainey and they can help facilitate connecting you to those that can provide the assistance. Any questions? We'll just escape from ours and we'll set up the next speaker. The next speakers is Stacy Schutz and Paul Lum. They're with the American Farmland Trust and they will be joining us virtually.
Hi, Trina, can you hear me? This is Stacy.
Now we can.
Great, well, thanks for having us. And thank you, for putting this on, ESRCD and EMRCD and all the other folks that have been involved in organization of this, this workshop. So my name is Stacy Schutz. I'm the California Climate and Agriculture Program Manager with American Farmland Trust. And I'm here with my colleague, Paul Lum, who's the Agricultural Specialist with American Farmland Trust. And American Farmland Trust is a national organization, but we do have an office in California and programs in California. And we're excited to talk with you today about the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, the RCPP, and the foundational group, the San Joaquin Valley Land and Water Conservation Collaborative that will be delivering what's part of the RCPP goals. So we'll talk through a few slides here and are happy to take any questions as well at the end. Next slide, please. So the San Joaquin Valley Land and Water Conservation Collaborative was created to fulfill the goals of a strategy in the San Joaquin Valley to support producers, in the face of all these groundwater challenges that have been coming up and that have been getting addressed through SGMA. And so it consists of 9 partners in the Valley. And as Trina mentioned, it's there are 4 RCDs actually, but 5 counties that we'll be working in. So from north to south, East Stanislaus County, Merced County, Madera, and Fresno and Tulare counties are part of this RCPP and part of this strategy for supporting producers with groundwater challenges. There are 2 other partners that are technology specific. So the Freshwater Trust and Conservation Biology Institute have supported and will continue to support this project with some of their platforms and technology tools. And then, of course, the Natural Resources Conservation Service is, a huge partner in supporting the funding of the goals of this collaborative. Next slide, please. So the goals of the collaborative are to protect and steward agricultural land in the valley. And that can be done a number of ways that we'll go into, including easements, conservation plans, conservation practices. Another goal of the collaborative is to support the technical assistance providers in the valley, including the RCDs that have the capacity and are building capacity to support producers with those plans and with easements and things like that. So those are 2 of the goals. And then the third is to reach new and underserved farmers. And there's a few ways that we can do that with existing programs that the American Farmland Trust has and that some of the other partners have. Next slide, please. So the technology partners that we mentioned, just to touch on those real quick, the Conservation Biology Institute with American Farmland Trust produced a tool called the Project Prioritization Tool. And this is a web-based mapping tool, as it says, essentially just a map that you can view, and we can insert as many layers and change as many layers as we want in order to see land in the valley on a map and visualize where prime farmland is, where the best groundwater recharge land is. And this helps us prioritize and understand, where valuable farmland is and what producers we can be working with in the valley to reach these goals of, towards groundwater sustainability. And that'll help us with those projects listed there, the conservation plans, the conservation practice implementation, easements, and strategic land retirement or repurposing. And then the Freshwater Trust has a platform, the second part there, called Basin Scout. And this is going to be piloted in Madera County for this RCPP. And this will essentially allow us to see the conservation practices, some of the conservation practices in Madera County, and understand on which parcels they would be most cost effective and most viable on which parcels. So that'll help us even further prioritize the parcels. Next slide, please. So the RCPP, again, it's a 5-year agreement with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And these 9 partners are going to deliver, I'm going to show you 8 goals. There are other goals, but these are the main 8. So I'll go through these kind of briefly. 1 and 2 are related to conservation plans and implementation. So we'll serve producers on 100,000 acres with conservation plans. And then a quarter of those practices that are included in the plans, a quarter of those will get implemented. That's number 2. And then number 3 and 4, those are related to conservation easements. So we're going to acquire 2 to 4 agricultural conservation easements to protect land that producers are voluntarily interested to protect. And we'll also identify 10 additional locations where there's high groundwater recharge potential for future easements. Next slide, please. Number 5 is related to repurposing, strategic repurposing or transitioning of land. And so there is some financial assistance to support 700 acres of land transition. And then number 6, 7, and 8 are related to outreach. Paul Lum has experience with these case studies under number 6, and that'll be, those will be written so that we can show the economic value of adopting the conservation practices that are prioritized in this project. And then 7 and 8 are related to workshops and specific technical and financial assistance to underserved farmers. Next slide, please. So some of the main bread and butter of the first, that first goal that we described, the conservation plans. Paul will be going into the conservation practices that will be included in those, but essentially these conservation plans are meant to work with producers to identify resource concerns in their area and resource concerns on their property and their goals of their property, and what kind of practices can be implemented to support their goals and their operations. Next slide, please. And now Paul will talk about the conservation practices. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Stacy. Conservation practices, they're NRCS equip practices. These are our deliverables for the RCPP, and there's some different purposes. Conservation cover, I'll talk about the first 5 bullets. In some conservation cover, the reduced tillage management, meaning no-till, cover cropping, critical area planning, and reduced tillage management, reduced till. These are soil health practices that the focus here is reducing reliance on groundwater pumping. So improved water holding capacity and improved irrigation infiltration. So by doing so, we've increased water content in the soil and making that water available to the plants, and again reducing reliance on groundwater pumping. A couple bullets after irrigation pipeline, irrigation water management. Well, I'll speak to irrigation pipeline, and then on the next page there's a water structure practice. These are conveyance practices. They could work kind of a multi-function. By conveyance, growers are allowed to move water around the farm, allocate their water supplies to best use. So that's a water conservation benefit, but also by conveyance, it's possible to develop an on-farm recharge system on their farm, and the on-farm recharge or basin recharge is a direct benefit to groundwater, by replenishing groundwater levels. So, and then the bottom, irrigation water management, that's more of a water conservation element. And Stacy, we could turn the next one. Pumping plant also, it's also a conveyance factor, again, enabling, water movement across the farm or enabling on-farm recharge. And the bottom two are the groundwater recharge basin or on-farm recharge practices. So these are big bang for the buck, putting water back into the groundwater table. And I wanted to talk about these 2 slides. On-farm recharge trials led by McMullen GSA. These trials are near Helm in Fresno County, and they started with pecans. So the trial currently is an extension of a prior trial. And so they're working on assessing and experimenting with duration of flooding, time of the year, frequency of flooding, and those impacts to the crop, to tree vigor, and any type of root impacts. So this is a really important trial. It's going to be able to demonstrate to farmers, the value of on-farm recharge or the negative impacts. So I think this is probably the largest scale and most comprehensive trial that's being conducted for on-farm recharge. And I'm going to put the website link to the trial findings and description of the trial in the chat. And I also wanted to talk to you about it. There's a tool that's being developed for on-farm recharge impacts, very quantitative level, a lot of data entry on impacts to almonds. And they've also studied duration of flooding, frequency, life stage, time of year. So, I think naturally we think of dormant period, but they've worked on different times, early January, mid-January that type of, timing. And I'll put a link to that tool. It's led by Sustainable Conservation, but it's quite a collaborative effort. And when information from that tool is released, it's going to be extremely valuable to growers to guide an on-farm recharge, program.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I think the next slide will close this up here. And this is our contact information. Don't hesitate to reach us. And you can also, of course, contact EMRCD or Stanislaus RCD if you're interested in conservation plans and, which leads to these conservation practices. And just to emphasize, this is a specific funding source. This RCPP is a specific funding source set aside for these conservation practices. And it's all in support of farmers' operations and supporting groundwater recharge. So thank you so much for allowing us to present. Have a great workshop.
Thank you, Stacy. While we have Stacy and Paul on the line, does anybody have questions here in the room? If you're online, if you have questions, please feel free to post it in the chat. All right, seeing none, then I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker. Jeff Borum has been with the East Stanislaus Resource Conservation District for 5 years now as our Soil Health Coordinator and Ag Programs Manager. So he's going to share a little bit about the work he does in the field.
Good morning. I can speak into the microphone. Is this true?
Yes, please.
Remember to do that. Testing. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone here and everyone on the webinar, as well as those that will be watching the video. As Trina said, I'm Jeff Borum, Soil Health Coordinator and Ag Programs Manager for East RCD. I think I just got to 6 years, very exciting. Just going to talk a little bit about improving ability to sink water and just some of the conservation practices that we focus upon. And that we do some research and coordinate research on. That's, I do a good amount of presenting, but a good portion of my time, probably over half, is done coordinating research with the universities, farmers, and others, on working lands. And so talk a little bit about that and how that can affect y'all or as producers or providers, PCAs, CCAs, etc. And the clicker. Not very good at this. Click right? Anyway. I believe it's my fault.
Alright, we'll go through that. This is not gonna work.
Okay. Can you click through? And I'm like, I can keep talking. No doubt about that. Yeah. Magic. Wait, go back one. Go back. Killed it. Awesome. Oh, maybe it's working. All right, really quickly, this is just quick cognitive map of where we're going, the basics or what I talk about in foundational stuff, because I do run some compost field trials and things like that, and I go and talk about compost and people are like, compost, so you just spread compost everywhere, that's not going to fix everything. I'm like, yeah, no, one tool in the toolbox, right? Like when we're doing compost out on rangelands, you want to think about grazing management first, those kind of basics. The other conservation practices, which I was talking about before, some of the on-farm and on-ranch trials that are going on working lands now, and that some of the things that are looking to happen, and then places to get paid for those things, and who to link up with, where to look, and who you can connect with, and if we have any time questions after that. I promise there's lots of pictures throughout this, but here's some words talking about the basics. when we go out and looking, especially, you know, orchards, row crops, what have you, anything that's irrigated lands, like irrigation efficiency, as others will talk to you later in these presentations, is of the utmost importance. You know, just fixing leaks and things like that can be really big on irrigation water management. And then for us on the research side and trying to promote some with farmers and ranchers is the irrigation water management that I think Paul mentioned in the last presentation. And that through, like we're working through NRCS, and I think others are as well, getting soil moisture sensors out there, being able to have a user interface so you can look at your data kind of in fairly real time and check out what's going on so that you can, you know, you're measuring something to manage it. You know, there's a direct cause there. As I talked about before, just, and as y'all know, I don't think, you know, might be preaching to the choir, and but grazing management, just when we're out doing compost, when we're out planting range plantings, like what have you, still like grazing management, you know, if you knock down the grasses down to where there's less than stubble, it's hard for it to bounce back. If you leave a little bit, usually it's a little better for it to bounce back, you know, but spreading compost when there's nothing there doesn't necessarily do anything. So trying to find the, you know, efficiency and effectiveness of these practices that we talk about, and I'll show some of them here. So here's some of the practices we talk about, and do need to remember that a lot of these practices are not necessarily new. And when I say not new, like cover croppings first talked about in European history, and I think 683 BCE by the poet Virgil, and it's in Asian culture 10,000 plus years ago. And so and a lot of these are indigenous practices from the Americas as well. That being said, we're trying to figure out how we dovetail these things in or integrate them into our production systems today, right? And so we've done some field trials on cover cropping around the state, and again, another not a silver bullet. Like I'm a big promoter of it. I will go out in a couple days again and plant some more, but it doesn't work everywhere, right? Every farm and ranch is different, as y'all know. We worked in the far northeast, and it can get down to -13 there in the winter, and you got a short season because you got potatoes and onions, and so you're trying to plant stuff in November or December and hoping it lives, and it's tough up there, so it might not be worth it, you know? Anyways, a lot of these things, you know, I mentioned sinking water in the beginning and then haven't talked too much about water, but we can pretty much link most all of these to not necessarily groundwater recharge, maybe some groundwater recharge, but also just keeping the water where your plants and where the production needs to be. And some of these are important ways. With cover cropping, you know, when there's infiltration issues, we might plant some daikon radish to break things up, break up the compaction. You know, which then increases infiltration often. Same with the compost application, you're adding organic matter. And so there's just, it can often make the soil a little spongier, especially at the top, and so that things help. Mulch application, natural air conditioner, especially out in our areas, is super important just for, natural air conditioner, not losing as much ET. And then for me, I work a lot on just not necessarily taking tillage away. A lot of orchard folks can do no-till pretty easily, especially if you're spraying the floors clean. But trying to reduce the tillage a little bit, just because often that can release the microbes into the air and get the sunshine, and then they burn up and they're not there and there's not as much life. And so I do often, you know, maybe work in biomass and cover crops or work in some compost, but trying to not have as many passes. It also then helps with not as many passes, you're not, you know, using as much fuel, so less costs on diesel. And then hedgerows for pollinators and beneficial insects along roadsides and things. Anyways, we coordinate research with quite a few folks. These are folks from UC Berkeley and UC Santa Barbara. We're working with Becca Riles in the Riles Agroecology Lab at UC Merced right now. We're co-PIs or principal investigators on our Conservation Innovation Grant through NRCS National, which is the soil health management systems on orchards in the Central Valley. And so taking a look at that, but all that to say, you know, we work with all these people and we're trying to constantly still remember to measure to manage. So not just measuring things so it comes out in a paper for folks, not that I don't want them to have their papers and such, but how can it help us? So why are we doing these things? One, so that I can drive a mini excavator around and then dig pits, because that's fun for me. And then we can also look at bulk density and things. You know, part of it is actually getting out there with the people collaborating, right? And a lot of the positives I've seen are the cultural exchange that happens with ranchers and farmers, and then the researchers, and everybody's eating sandwiches in the dirt and it's dusty, and it's just there's a camaraderie thing to it. And I think there is a big part to that, to us working together and keep some of these things going. These are some of the things we measure for. Soil carbon has been a big deal. It'll be hopefully a bigger deal when some of these carbon markets will pay a worthwhile dollar, not $5 to the ton or something like that. So let's see. So species composition is a big deal, but we like to look at things, compaction, infiltration. You know, I talked about that natural air conditioner. I like to take people out on some of the compost field trials, and on one side where the compost is spread, I have them take their shoes off, right? And when you touch it, it's cooler than when you go over on the other side and it's warmer. And so that's something to remember, and it's something that's, you know, fairly real and tangible. But a lot of these other things are important for a lot of other reasons. You know, but again, we're looking at things often that matter to folks, to ranchers around the state, forage production, right? And part of this, again, you're spreading the compost, hoping that the water's sticking around a little more, and then being able to utilize it. The other reason that we do these research trials, and I don't have a picture here for that, I don't think, is we were helping NRCS to create an interim practice standard, and those practice standards are like kind of the ones Paul and Stacey listed up there. But this new one they were trying to put out, and we helped them do that through these trials, right? CPS 808 and that soil carbon amendment, so that now around the nation, farmers and ranchers can get paid for putting compost on, or biochar, or some things like that. And so trying to do the trials, again, to help people measure to manage, but also kind of push the policy and get farmers and ranchers paid, and paid in more efficient ways. That's a big thing that we work with on our Conservation Innovation Grant. Again, just some of the takeaways there that were important to us, things like aggregate stability and compaction and infiltration. Nope, there's something. I see something. Oh well. So while they do that, we're running these Conservation Innovation Grant trials. Oh, lovely. And that was part of them. Oh, maybe we can go back one. Yeah. This is us just again taking data in some orchards. This is important because right now we're doing some research with folks, but we're also now looking for 10 other farms each year to implement some of these things like cover cropping, irrigation water management, nutrient water management, composting or mulching, depending, and maybe reduction of tillage, hedgerows, and things like that. And we have funding for that, and whereas most things reimburse you, we are trying to pay for things on the front end. So instead of giving, you know, you buying the seed and us reimbursing you, as many of these ones do, we just buy the seed for you and ship it to you. And so we're just trying to show them that that's easier and simpler. And so that's a big part of our trials. Those are going on right now. We're looking for folks with around 100 acres or more in general, but feel free to contact us, and there'll be flyers that are up here as well for that. This is just just something that we often do with folks I work with some of these practices. When I'm talking to folks, I just usually have a one pager with me of like some of the benefits, like why you would do cover cropping, but then where to get the equipment, possibly where to get seed. You know, at the RCDs, we can't necessarily advocate advocate for anyone specifically. Like I can say I've worked with Camprath seeds and had really good experiences with them, but here are also like a couple others, right? And that's what I would say. And that's for me. If for you might be different, all good. And then some references if they're into like looking up their own stuff too. Okay, getting towards the end here, y'all. These are some of the programs, and I believe that Trina probably already touched on a couple of these. Paul and Stacy already touched on a couple of these, and then I've already talked about the top one there with the Sig Orchard trials. And for those of you in the room, this is what the flyer looks like that'll be up here. Also, again, of course, I talked about Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, quite a bit. I think Trina mentioned EQIP. There's also the Conservation Reserve Program, there's CRP, which can help you basically taking sensitive farm or ranch land out of production and planting some certain species and things like that. And then I believe you get a rental fee for those things, basically. And so those things are citing our SIG, our Conservation Innovation Grant, is through NRCS as well. CDFA right now, SWEEP for irrigation just came out yesterday, I think. And so that's there. If you're an irrigation person too, that one's pretty solid because you usually can try and help fill it out for your farmers and producers or farmers and ranchers, and they'll usually use you, right? And so it's a win-win situation, and SWEEP's been pretty solid, and glad they have some funding for that. Also right now on their demos and their incentive, it's like $10.32 or $10.34 per linear foot of planting hedgerows, and that's a pretty good deal, even if you got to bring a little water out to them. Right 100 is new. They're kind of pushing nationally. They're looking for $100. They're trying to push, looking for carbon practices being done, these conservation practices, right? And they're pushing to give farmers and ranchers $100 an acre or $100 an animal unit. That's kind of their, it's a political, like, make it easy. This is 100, but it's something to look for if it actually comes out. And then zero food print. Last week I was talking about this compost connector is something new, and they hadn't come out with, but I think yesterday also, or 2 days ago, it did come out. Zero food print. We've had some experience in Merced and Stanislaus working with the Gamperleys. They got a California Restore grant, and I'm doing some verification for that on them. That's for any of those practices we kind of talked about. You can put in for up to $25,000. For the compost connector, I think they will pay more. They're looking for you to put your name into a place, and they want you to look for the connection to your own compost. But if you can get the compost and you can get the analytics, they'll pay you for it. Now, they won't mess with the logistics or nothing, right? If it comes and it's weird or anything happens, they're hands off. They just want to pay. But they will pay folks for it, and it's a direct, like here, they will pay the invoice. So there's nothing much you got to do, possibly pay for part of the trucking or something like that, which is, trucking's often some of the most, but they are looking to pay for a chunk of that because they're mostly trying to push compost. Cool. References, that is it. I think that is all my time. Feel free, I'll be up in the front here for a little bit. Trina has all my info, and then on those flyers is Andrea Brophy's info, our community programs manager, and that's also a great way to get a hold of me because my email fills up. Anyways, thanks so much, y'all. I appreciate it.
You didn't talk anything about the gypsum. Are you guys paying anything for that? Any grants for it, or what are your opinions?
Oh, I mean, I have opinions, but we haven't utilized gypsum or like paid specifically for gypsum, no, in any of our grants. Not that we haven't worked with producers to spread it at a certain time, integrated into these systems, but I think maybe you could honestly maybe pay through NRCS's nutrient management, maybe? I don't know that though. I feel like that's an NRCS question. I apologize. Yeah, Because we're going off of a lot of what theirs are. We're trying to help them build other practice standards. But I don't know, I would ask somebody, because I think there's nothing directly that I know of for that, and I don't think the Soil Carbon Amendment 808 would count for that either. But I can find out for you.
Because I think the issue with compost and all those, especially in this area with this drought and everything, you go around, drive around, you see, all that salt problems in the objects. Okay, over there, I think it will be better, and people will be very reluctant to put any compost or manure to those orchards. It's going to make it worse.
Oh, like if you're saying for manure where the nitrogen would.
Mainly the salt problem. We are having a lot of salt issues.
Mm-hmm. And I think I need to put, but we can talk more about compost. If you've had salt issues directly with compost as well. Manure, definitely, I've seen, but not compost in my experience as much. Thanks, y'all.
All right, so our next speaker is one of our educational partners with UCA&R, Dr. Khalid Ali, and we've made you the host, so hopefully you can go ahead and share your presentation.
All right, thank you, Trina. Good morning. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about irrigation scheduling, and we're just going to keep it basic and simple. I'm Khalid Bali, and I'm irrigation specialist based at the Kearney Ag Center in Fresno County. As you know, we're going through tough times when it comes to drought and limited water supplies. So what can we do to help with this situation? One of these things that we could do is to improve irrigation efficiency, whether we're looking at the existing irrigation system and improve the efficiency, or if we try to move from one irrigation system to another.
Dr. Khalid, your presentation is not showing through.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Can you see it now?
No.
Oh, boy.
Okay. If you'd like, we can share from here, and you just have to let us know when to click.
Yeah. How about if you share the one that we had last week?
Yes, I can do that.
All right, thank you. Sorry about this.
No problem. Just take us a minute to open it.
Okay.
Okay. Your slides are now viewable.
Okay, next screen, please. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, we're going through drought, and there are ways where we can help and try to deal with this situation. One of these things that we can do is improve irrigation efficiency. While we're either looking at improving the irrigation efficiency at the existing system or move to a more efficient irrigation system. And typically right now, with lots of funding available, a lot of farmers are converting from flood to drip irrigation. Another thing that we could do is regulated deficit irrigation. That is something specific to certain crops. And one of these crops is alfalfa. So you could do deficit irrigation in summertime, trying to save some water and use it on the crops that you cannot do deficit irrigation like tree crops. We can look at new cropping systems, basically low ET crops that are grown for a relatively short period of time. In some other regions in California, they're looking at land fallowing and taking land out of production to conserve water and make it available for other ag users or urban users. Or, in this talk, we're going to focus on irrigation management. And when it comes to irrigation management, it's basically looking at irrigation scheduling and the new technologies that can save water. Next slide, please. So what do we mean by irrigation water management? It's basically three basic components. One of them is applying the right amount of water to meet the crop water demand. And we can think about it in so many different terms, but to make it simple, you can think about, how many inches we need to apply in every irrigation event, or how many gallons of water are needed per tree whenever we irrigate. We can also look at, timing of irrigation events, frequency. How many irrigations do we need to apply in any given week? Can we do one irrigation per week or 3 or 5? And that depends on the type of irrigation system that we have and the soil type. The third component is making sure that we are efficient when we are applying this water. And the term that is commonly used is DU, distribution uniformity, and that is good indicator of the efficiency of our irrigation system. Next slide, please. So when it comes to irrigation scheduling, I would like to keep it simple and just know what's going on. It's just like, how long does it take to drive from Merced to San Francisco? In general, we could say 2.5 hours. And we need to look at so many other factors because that trip could take 2.5 hours. It could take 4 hours. It could take 3.5 hours, depending on other factors like traffic, the time of the day, and so on. So when we talk about ETO, it's basically looking at the 2.5 hours. That's a good estimates of how long does it take to drive to San Francisco. ETO is basically the amount of water used by unstressed cool season grass. So we can start with that one, and that is relatively easy, simple, doesn't cost any money, and the information is available on the internet. Now, the next thing is to fine tune that rough estimate. And the easiest way to fine tune this is by using soil moisture sensor. Using a soil moisture sensor is just like, looking at GPS. GPS will give you an idea about, all right, it's not 2.5 hours, it's going to be 3 hours. And as you're driving, that time will keep updating based on accidents on the road and so on. So the soil moisture sensor is like our GPS. And now we can go to another level, which is more complicated. It takes more time, like plant-based approach. And one common one that we use on almond all the time is stem water potential. The disadvantage of the third approach here to fine-tune the irrigation scheduling is it takes time and you have to be in the field. While as for soil moisture sensor, you can install it in the field, you can get the data remotely and make decisions without having to make so frequent trips to the field. The best approach is to look at the above three and to make decisions based on ET, soil moisture, and what the plant tells you in terms of stress and so on. And I want to talk today about advances in irrigation technology to estimate ETC, especially over the last 10 years. We have lots of advances when it comes to irrigation technology. And I will be discussing a few of these advances. Next slide, please. Okay, so how much water do we need to apply? That the question for, the answer for this question, it depends on what type of irrigation system that we have, as well as on our soil type and the crop. But in general, if we're looking at irrigation systems with surface or flood irrigation system, we typically apply lots of water, anywhere from 3 to 4 inches, but it could be as high as 10 inches for lighter soils. Sprinkler irrigation, we apply less, anywhere from half an inch to 1 inch, an inch and a half. With a drip irrigation, even we apply a lot less. Typical drip irrigation event would be anywhere, from half an inch to 1 inch. Next slide, please. So when it comes to understanding soil moisture, I like to keep it simple and imagine if you can take 1 foot of the soil profile and extract all the moisture out of it. If you take that 1 foot and put it in an oven and completely dry it, you may get about 6 inches. So out of the 12 inches of the soil profile, you're going to get 6 inches of water. Now, that water is not all available to plant. Most of it, I would say about 50% of that, like let's say 3 inches, is held tightly by the soil, depending on the soil type. And the other 3 inches, most likely they're available to the plant. But those 3 inches are not completely available to all crops. Some crops are very sensitive to moisture stress. So if you're growing strawberry, that you may only have 1 inch or half an inch out of that foot of soil available to the plant. If you're growing alfalfa, you may have those 3 inches or 2 inches. So there are lots of terms that you don't need to worry about, but basically just know, how much is available to your crop. That depends on the crop, and that depends on the soil type before you reach stress. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do I know what type, how much moisture I have available? The best thing to do is get to know your soil type. Knowing the soil type will make a big difference because it will impact the soil moisture holding capacity, the infiltration rate, how fast that water is moving into the ground, especially if we're looking at groundwater recharge, we need to know what's the infiltration rate. The irrigation frequency will depend on the soil type. If we're on the heavy side, we can do less frequent irrigation. If we're on the lighter side, we have to do more frequent irrigation because the soil cannot hold too much moisture. So in this example here, soil type, it says loam, soil type 114 and loam. Next slide, please. In general, there are so many different classifications for soil texture, which is basically how much sand, silt, and clay you have in the soil profile. But to keep it simple, I like to just lump, the soils on the heavier side together. They have high water holding capacity, but lower infiltration rate. So if you have a clay soil, clay loam, those are, with high water holding capacity and low infiltration rate, those soil types are not good for doing groundwater recharge. Then we have the medium type soil, which is the best in general. So if you have a loam or silty loam, that is good because you have a medium water holding capacity and medium infiltration rate. And then the other group is the soils that they're relatively on the light side, like, sandy soil, silty soil. They have very low water holding capacity and high infiltration rate. So with those soil types, I need to do more frequent irrigations because if I'm applying too much water in any single irrigation event, I'm going to lose that moisture below the root zone. Next slide, please. It's relatively easy to know your soil type. There are lots of resources on the web. And the one that I find the easiest for me is the soil the Web Soil Survey, that's from USDA and RCS. It's basically the old soil maps, but right now they're available on the internet. You can go there, click on your farm, define, the area of interest, how many acres that you're farming, and you can generate report, and it will tell you, what kind of soil that you have. Next slide, please. So when it comes to, soil moisture, typically for tree crops, I always like to think that the root zone is about 4 feet. Excuse me. So 4 feet. When we look at 4 feet, most of the roots, they're going to be in the upper 2 feet. So, and most of the extraction will be in the upper 2 feet. So in this example here, it says most of the roots, 40% are in the top foot, 30% in the second quarter, and 20% in the third quarter, and 10% on the fourth quarter. Well, keep in mind, this depends on the irrigation system. If you have flood irrigation, you're going to have roots going all the way down to 4 feet, and you're going to have extraction going, for the entire root zone. If you have drip irrigation, most likely your most of the uptake is going to be from the top 2 feet of the soil profile. Now, you could use a soil moisture sensor. I like to have a shovel, go to the field and feel the soil moisture, but the soil moisture sensor will give you, automated rating that you can access from, any location. In this example, like let's say at this example, we have, the 12, 24, 36, and 48 inches. The top foot of the soil profile, it says 33 centibar is just basically the tension. The lower the number, the higher the soil moisture content. So in this example, for almond, this is relatively good, and the crop is not stressed. I go at the second foot, and 38, and again, excuse me, this is a good excuse me, good soil moisture content. Now, when you go to the third foot and fourth foot, it's a good idea to know what's the moisture content at the fourth foot, because that will give you an idea if you have excessive irrigation. If the fourth foot is relatively wet, it means you have deep percolation and you're over irrigating. Next slide, please. So why do we irrigate? We need to irrigate to replace the crop evapotranspiration. And the crop evapotranspiration is basically, can be estimated from the reference evapotranspiration, the amount of water used by unstressed grass. And then we can relate this one to our crop by crop coefficient. And with that crop coefficient, we can determine the actual crop water use, for, and in this case, we call it ETC. We need also to keep in mind the irrigation efficiency, and this is a range of irrigation efficiencies for different systems. If we have 100% irrigation efficiency, then we're doing great, and we don't need to apply additional water. In general, if you have anywhere from 85 to 95%, 85 to 95%, you're doing great, and the irrigation efficiency is wonderful. If it is 60%, 50%, when you do the DU evaluation test, that means, you have to apply a lot more water because the lower efficiency. Next slide, please. In general, ETO is determined by having a weather station. And in California, there are about 150 CIMIS, California Irrigation Management Information System weather stations all over the state. We take that ETO and multiply it by crop coefficient. That will give us the estimated amount of the water that we need for our crop. If we have stress because we're not irrigating as often as we should, our crop coefficient would be lower and the yield will be impacted. Next slide, please. In the old days, we used to have the CIMIS map. And if you want to start, that's a good start to look at the CIMIS map. The state has 18 different regions. And you can just look at the city where you're located and find the reference evapotranspiration for that area. Next slide, please. And in this example, we have the different zones. Modesto would be, for example, zone 12, Sacramento zone 14, Hanford zone 16, and so on. You can look at the table and look how many inches that you have in any given month. So for example, in May here, I'm looking at zone 12, I have about 7 inches per month. Or if I divide it by, 30, I will get about, 2/10 of an inch per day. That's a good start. It's like, the drive to San Francisco is 2.5 hours. So this is a good indication for me how many inches I need to apply on any given basis. Next slide, please. Over the last 10 years, CIMIS has improved a lot, and we have spatial CIMIS. So rather than looking at the station close to you, you can just click on a map. Next slide. And clicking on the map will give you, good approximation about the ETO for your farm. I like to use spatial CIMIS, especially, in times where we have lots of variation in ETO. If you remember from previous slide, we said, well, our reference evapotranspiration in May is about 2/10 of an inch. Now you can look at the ETO for the entire state and for your location. And these are 3 different dates in May, 24, 25th, 26th. And you could see the map looks a lot different from one day to another. Next slide, please. And basically, you can click on the map, find the ETO, or better yet, what I do is I can create the sites that they're interest to me. And in this example, you can create, as many sites as you want. And CIMIS will send you a weekly update of the reference evapotranspiration over the last week for the sites that you selected. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this case, this is an almond, commercial almond field in Hanford area. This is May, in May. You can look over a 7-day period. We have lots of variability and reference evapotranspiration. We have ETO of 0.25, the maximum, and on some days ETO is 1/10 of an inch. So I need, if I do a fine tuning and use this information, and I can apply the right amount of water based on the actual ET. There's no point for me to apply extra water if my ETO in May is 1/10 of an inch. You can see here we have about 50% variability within the week. On the same token, summertime, like let's say we go to June, July, and we have hot days, the ETO would be a lot more than the normal. And we need to keep that in mind when it comes to irrigation scheduling. For flood irrigation, slight variability or high variability in ETO from one day to another, it will not make any difference because we're using, we're applying lots of moisture, lots of water, and the soil moisture is relatively good, and you can weather hot days. But if you're doing drip irrigation, you have to be really careful, because if you under irrigate, you will end up with the stress situation when we have high ETO in summer times. Next slide, please. Okay, so the ETO is basically the amount of water available for use by unstressed water, unstressed grass, and that depends mostly on the weather. It's solar radiation, humidity, temperature, and wind. The crop coefficient account for the variables related to the crop, as well as, the variables related to the irrigation system, the irrigation frequency. If we irrigate every day and using sprinkler irrigation, our ET will be high because we have lots of evaporation. If we have drip irrigation, same ground, same conditions, the same tree age, the same tree shading, our evaporation will be a lot less. So you need to keep this in mind when you look at the crop coefficient for your farm. Next slide, please. So how do we determine crop coefficient? It's basically we use methods, scientific methods, to come up with the actual evapotranspiration for the crop. And this could be a weather station, could be lysimeter, and we divide it by the reference evapotranspiration, and that will give us the crop coefficient. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is in general how the crop coefficient looks like. If you have an almond and, in March, your crop coefficient is relatively small, maybe 30, 40%. And as you go into the summer, the crop coefficient could be 100% of ETO, maybe 110, 120, depending on the tree size and the irrigation system that you have and the wetting frequency. Next slide, please. This is just to give you an idea about how we determine the crop coefficient. This is for sunflower. We're looking at the actual evapotranspiration, dividing it by ETO, and we will get the crop coefficient. Next slide, please. So you can see here, the crop coefficient. We have the data that we collected in the field, and from that data, we try to make it nice and smooth and come up with a crop coefficient for this crop. Next slide, please. There are lots of advances when it comes to methods to estimate actual evapotranspiration. These pictures are of systems that we use to come up with actual evapotranspiration for crops. You can see on the left olives and on the right alfalfa. Now we have other much more simple and commercially available tools, for example, Thule and Arable Mark. In the future, we're gonna be able to see maps for actual evapotranspiration, and that should be coming on, just within a relatively short period of time. Next slide, please. This is one of these systems. This is called Thule technology. You can get lease a system for about $1,650 right now for field crops. For tree crops, there's additional $500 charge, because of the additional work it takes for the installation. And this is one of the systems that is eligible for SWEEP grant. So if you're applying for a SWEEP grant, you can have a system like this, and CDFA will pay for it. Next slide, please. These are examples of some of the other methods that we can detect stress in the plant. That would be, like infrared thermometer. And that infrared thermometer will give you an idea if you have stress or not. You could see a tower on the right-hand side. You could see a tower way up there. That's also in the experimental stage right now. That measures the infrared temperature and covers like an area of about half a mile or so. Next slide, please. This is another tool called Arable Mark. And that sensor also, you buy the sensor and there is a subscription service, and it will tell you a whole bunch of, variables. One of them, actual evapotranspiration, crop coefficient, rainfall, temperature, solar radiation, and a whole bunch of different, data available. Some of these may not be, too much for you, but like, let's say if I want to measure, get an idea of actual evapotranspiration, that's another tool for getting the actual evapotranspiration. Next slide, please. We've done some work on these technologies. This is Thule and how it correlates to the state-of-the-art method for measuring evapotranspiration, the eddy covariance method. And you could see it's relatively good, you know, within 5% of the actual ET measured by the eddy covariance method. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go here into too much details because I know the engineers from NRCS will cover this later on in the talk. But basically, you can determine the reference evapotranspiration, the crop coefficient, and make calculations about how much you need to run the system. Next slide, please. And, you know, keep in mind that you have to consider the irrigation efficiency. The application efficiency, depending on if it's flood irrigation, it would be the application efficiency. If it is a drip irrigation system, it would be DU or the distribution uniformity. Next slide, please. And then you can come up with the irrigation time needed, you know, on a daily basis. And in this case, is about 4 hours. Next slide, please. There are other technologies. One of them is series, and those are, you know, remotely sensed method. It basically they fly over the field and they can give you an idea about, you know, the stress level that you have. This is a 70-acre commercial almond field that we have in Hanford. And you could see this is very simple looking at April 10th and looking at the color. You know, the red shows stress, yellow moderate stress, and blue unstressed. So you could see that on April 10th, the field is stressed. I can make decisions and say, well, you know, I have to apply more irrigation water. And you look at May and early May and mid-May, that most of the field is not stressed. You know, we have relatively, you know, good conditions in the field. Sometimes the stress is related to moisture. Sometimes the stress is related to something else like salinity, or it could be soil compaction. So we need to know why we have stress. If it's related to salinity, we need to do leaching, and we need to consider that in our management, you know, decisions. Next slide, please. Now, you know, you can fine tune. There is a service available from the Cooperative Extension in Fresno County, which is basically they will send you on Friday, they will send you a weekly ET report for the major crops that you have in the region. And you could see here, you know, we're calculating some of those numbers. It's basically saying, well, you know, my ETC for citrus was 1 inch last week. And, you know, for my irrigation efficiency of about 85%, I need to apply 1.2 inches. And then looking at the tree spacing, I can determine how many gallons of water that I need to apply for each tree. Next slide, please. And, you know, this is, I'm not going to go again into details. This will be available for your reference. We need to look at the ET for our crop last week. We also need to consider if we have, you know, rainfall event. And this doesn't, you know, during dry years, you know, we have less rainfall. But in some years, as you know, even going back like 2-3 years, 2019, we had moisture in May. We had rainfall in May. And we need to take that into account. So if my crop water use is 1.25 over the last week and I get 1/2 inch of rain this week, I need to subtract that 1/2 inch. Next slide, please. Okay, so there is another way to calculate, you know, how much, how long you need to run the irrigation system by looking at, how many gallons you need per tree, multiplying it by the number of trees that you have in the zone or in the farm. And in this case, it's about 650,000 gallons. You need to look at your flow meter reading. And this is also something that you can get funding from CDFA, the SWEEP program. If you have an existing flow meter that is not functioning or it's not accurate, you can replace it with a new one. If you don't have a flow meter, you really need to have a flow meter because it can tell you a lot. In this example, my flow meter is showing, 800 gallons per minute. So basically I can do 650,000 divided by 800, and that will tell me how many hours I need to run the system for this week. And in this situation is about, 14 hours. Having a flow meter will make a big difference if the design for your irrigation system showing that you need to have about 800 gallons per minute. Well, you look at your flow meter. If you have 900 or 1,000, what happens? It's most likely you have a leak somewhere in the farm, so you can fix that leak. So just looking at the flow meter itself can help you a lot when it comes to making decisions whether you need to repair the system or see what's going on. Next slide, please. This is an example of the Thule technology. They have really good website and the information is very helpful. You don't even need to worry about, finding your soil type. The minute you have a system, they will find the soil type. They will come up with the soil water holding capacity. And in this case is about, 6 inches. Next slide, please. You could enter the application rate for the irrigation system that you have. And in this case is about 1/10 of an inch per hour. Next slide, please. And they will give you an idea about, what's the actual ET over the last week. So you don't have to worry about measuring it. You don't have to worry to go to CMS or about the crop coefficients. You're getting the bottom line here. Next slide, please. And this is what makes it so simple. Well, they tell you, all right, so you need to run your system for 10.5 hours to compensate for the ET that you lost over the last week. And they even show you, what's the average application rate for similar fields around your farm. So you have an idea about what your neighbors are doing and whether you're, close to them or, you have special situation where you have to take into account. This is my alarm. I only have 3 minutes left. Next slide, please. This is graphic that gives you, if you see the dark green here, it shows that, I'm doing a good job with irrigation most of the time, and I am within the target zone. Applying the right amount of water doesn't just save water, it saves water and energy. And with the bottom line, you spend less money on energy. Next slide, please. We talked about plant-based approach. This is the stem water potential on almond. This is a great tool. The only disadvantage is it has to be done at certain time of the year, certain time of the day, and you have to be in the field. Actually, Thule is developing similar technology, but right now they've been testing it on grapes. It's not available for other crops. Next slide, please. Okay, there are dendrometers that they can also give you an idea whether the tree is stressed or not, and will give you an indication when you need to irrigate. Next slide, please. Again, the series imaging is also a good indicator of plant stress, where you don't have to worry about, going to the field. Next slide, please. And just to summarize, you need to start somewhere, and that somewhere is ETO. Get to know the ETO for your region on average, and then get to know your soil type. Good idea to look at the soil maps. Good idea to do a backhoe test and look at the soil profile so you know what's going on in your field. You need to adjust the irrigation scheduling based on at least soil moisture sensors, because they're relatively easy and there's plenty of funding available to get them. You can look at plant health indicators and temperature, for example, and that's also eligible for funding. You want to make sure that you evaluate your irrigation system, and we have a great speaker who's going to talk about this later on. You need to consider the irrigation water quality. We didn't talk about this a lot, but if you have, groundwater that has high salinity, you need to consider leaching and what impact it will have on your irrigation management decisions. And keep in mind, saving water will save money and will also save energy. There are lots of advances when it comes to irrigation scheduling and irrigation management. It would be great if you can take advantage of these tools that they're available, especially around these times where we have plenty of funding available to help getting these technologies. Next slide. Thank you so much. I'll open it up for questions if we have any. Thank you.
Do we have any questions in the room? We're checking online. I don't see any. Jeff, you had an answer to a question earlier.
I think I still need to speak into this. So you asked about gypsum and NRCS, and so for the gypsum, it looks like they came out with it last year, amending soil properties with gypsum products. It is Conservation Practice Standard, or CPS 333 for that. So they are paying for that, at least NRCS. I don't know. I can find out more if that's on the CDFA's list of practices for NRCS in their Healthy Soils program or anything like that as well. But that's all. Thanks.
Well, with that, we'll take a quick 10 to 15 minute break before we go to our next speaker. Again, housekeeping on the attendees list. If you could please change your screen name if you can. You should be able to hover over to the right of your name, and it should give you an option to rename. If you're not able to do that, please contact the East Merced RCD office so we can make sure you have a full list of who attended. Thank you, and we will be back at 10:30. One after that.
The second half of mine is a lot of meetings.
That's good because there's no reviews on slide.
If you have the same problem with the again, where you can't switch slides, well, I'm just saying there's some kind of. Just in case there's some kind of. You want that. I think I'm saying, a lot of time they switch slides, just definitely different.
Only programs, the only things as of now are the two presentations that go after it. But everyone does it, they want it. Like, something might be doing something totally different.
Last time I ever reminded you guys.
It's kind of an important thing. Yeah.
I'm out of here.
Okay, bye. Don't forget the text.
Yeah, I know. See, that's what I've seen, that's why I told you.
Don't have to look at you.
No, you're coming out.
So much power.
Safe travels.
I know. Glad you weren't too late today.
Right? I'll let my reservation.
Thank you. Get that rolled under you all. Hey, Ursula, Rachel, are you doing the figure out the algorithm? Or, did you ask for the yeah, I didn't even know she was doing it. Just let me controls. You know, have all the controls. But I'll be
Oh my god, that's sour. I ate on that sour.
Just one wanted to get like 5 minutes to go outside. Yeah. got most everybody back in the room. Hopefully, if you're online, you're tuning back in. I'd like to introduce Rex DeFore, who is with NCAT, and he can explain a little bit better all the things that they do there. Rex?
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I'm just gonna start my video just so you can see who's presenting. Hi. But I'm gonna turn this off just so the PowerPoint is not overly taxed by a lot of stuff going on in the computer. So today I'm going to be talking about, at first I'm going to be talking about soils and soil management, basically about investing in your soils as you would invest in new farm equipment, for example, or maintaining buildings or training up your farm staff. Then I'll be talking a little bit about nitrogen management and how to approximate some nitrogen inputs and outputs in your nitrogen management plans. And I'm just, I'm broadcasting from up here in Davis, California. And I'm pretty excited because we're predicted to get between 3 and 4 inches of rain in the next few days. And it rained last night. It's nice to see some water falling from the sky. It's just, I don't think I've ever been as excited to see rain. And because woodlands, normally, I live in Woodland, work in Davis, and normal precipitation here is about 18 inches. Last year, we got just over 4. So anyway, that's good news. Just wanted to say a few words about NCAT. There we go. NCAT is a 501c3 nonprofit. We have several offices scattered around the country. Our biggest project is something called the ATRA project. It's a National Sustainable Ag Information Service. This is the website. ATRA is a really good resource for farmers and farms. We have run a couple toll-free lines, one in English, one in Spanish. You can talk to a live person with any question related to organic or sustainable production or marketing of crops and livestock. At least half our staff are farmers or former farmers, and we all have long experience in organic and sustainable agriculture. The website has hundreds of resources on a wide range of topics in formats, however you want to digest information. We have publications, podcasts, videos, webinars, searchable databases, and blogs as well. And it's especially helpful for beginning farmers or farmers of all experiences. Might help you to avoid some big mistakes. And I really appreciate what Dr. Bali presented about. I always learn something from these presentations, and I'm glad Jeff came back. And I didn't realize NRCS had a cost share about adding essentially calcium to your soils. That apparently that's a new cost share. And I'm registered as a technical service provider with NRCS in California and Nevada. So anyway, now what Dr. Bali and other presenters today are talking about is very important. Like irrigation water volumes need monitoring. Irrigation systems need to be maintained for effective use of our water resource and to be efficient in applying what looks to be an increasingly scarce resource. So the drip irrigation, subsurface, micro sprinklers, soil moisture monitoring is critically important. And looking at evapotranspiration, those are all part of the toolbox that we can use to more efficiently use this water resource. But if your soils are not in good shape, the soil surface where kind of the rubber meets the road, right? Where the water either infiltrates or not. If you're not allowing good infiltration or water storage, you're not getting efficient use of your irrigation infrastructure. It's kind of like putting $100 saddle on a $10 horse. You need to really pay attention to soil health in order for your irrigation system and your soils actually to perform up to snuff. So, yeah. So, and plus, I don't know if you're aware, we're mostly working with degraded resource. This study that I'm showing here, this study estimated that about 3/4 of the land in North America has degraded soils. It's mostly due to lack of organic matter. That results in a lot of negative things, compaction, infiltration rates decrease pretty significantly. Salinity is also a problem in the West. And that's why we need to start investing in our soils. With the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, being implemented, it's probably likely that water will be a little bit less plentiful in the future. So our soils, we need to get our soils in better shape to allow infiltration of every drop of rainwater and irrigation water. What Dr. Bali and others are going to be, or have discussed and will be discussing today, that's part of the toolbox. Just to note that well-managed soils infiltrate and store water, not to mention nutrients, much more effectively than poorly managed soils. And the kind of the secret or the main functional characteristic of well-managed soils is the presence of sufficient amounts of organic matter to help the soil ecology, help the soil function to its maximum potential. And the thing is, our soils really aren't ready for the stresses, which include extreme rainfall events, droughts, extreme wind events. Last week I saw, I work up here in the Sacramento Valley. There was a lot of our fine clay soils blowing down into the San Joaquin Valley. And if we have a southerly wind, well, we get some of that soil back, but it's not an ideal way of managing your soil. So I don't know if any of this looks familiar, but there's a cost for ignoring the soil ecology. I don't think we've been managing as a society our soils for the soil ecology. We've been kind of trained to add NPK and kind of ignoring the microbiology, which really drives soil function. So there's the cost is poor infiltration of rainwater and irrigation water. That picture on the left, a lot of that water won't drain in, and it's affecting the roots of those almond trees. It's creating anaerobic conditions. Roots don't like that kind of thing. It allows disease. And then on the right there, that's when these soils, when all this water evaporates and goes away, that's what you're left with. You have these soils that are sealed up with clay, like a clay layer on top of a fine seal that doesn't allow water infiltration. It doesn't allow air infiltration, and roots need to breathe. And so if you're managing your soils where the aggregates are easily destroyed, then you're going to have these sealed soils. So poor recharge of the water table, more flooding downstream and more silt going downstream, ever decreasing water storage capacity of the soils, because organic matter is like a sponge. It has the ability to absorb and store a lot more water than most of the mineral components. Lack of nutrient storage, soil erosion from wind and rain. And, you know, as I said, anaerobic conditions, you don't want that in your soil. So the reason I'm showing this slide, the only reason is you have sand, silt, and clay particles, and you want to have these particles to be aggregated together. And this only happens in biologically active soils. There's the fungal component of the microbial ecosystem provides these glomalins. They're essentially glues that create these aggregates, these stable aggregates. If you have sufficient bacteria, there's polysaccharides, which also act like glues. And these soil aggregates are critical to soil function. If you have these stable aggregates, the picture on your left, you know, you have infiltration of the water happens much more readily, gets into the root zone, and then ultimately into the water table. If you have the situation on the right, you know, unstable aggregates, the second you have some rainfall, those aggregates fall apart. The clay particles go up to the surface, they form the seal, then subsequent rain or irrigation water is gonna run off. It's not gonna be absorbed as readily. So what happens at the surface sometimes doesn't stay at the surface. Good soil structure, yeah, better infiltration. No soil structure, very little infiltration. And what's the payoff for adding organic matter? You know, well, just kind of the opposite of all those things I mentioned earlier. Plus, you know, it resists compaction. Most of our soils have what I call a plow layer, or like an area that it's condensed, and water and roots can't really get past it very easily. And, you know, if you're an orchardist, I've seen this reported from walnut and almond farmers. You know, some of these folks started using cover crops, including some mustards. And in walnuts, the Pradolinkus problems decreased dramatically, and almonds, root knot decreased very dramatically. So there are a lot of benefits to managing your soil as an ecosystem. I guess I'll leave it at that. You know, I'm just going to cover a few chipping prunings. This has become pretty standard practice, I feel, you know, and a lot of the orchardists rotate, kind of do alternate chipping. So this year, one alley will be the home to the prunings and the chippings. And the next year, the alternate alley will be. And that way you can spread the kind of the organic matter wealth across your orchard. Cover crops, especially, you know, there's a lot of new orchards, almond orchards and pistachio orchards, a few new walnut orchards, not that many, going into the ground, especially with new orchards. You know, why not cover that ground? You know, you might even be able to get some wheat hay off the alleys in the first few years. You're not going to need to shake the trees to drop the nuts on the orchard floor anyways for the first few years. So why not manage your soil if you can, you know, put in some cover crops. You'll be pretty surprised at the benefits. And compost too. I've seen this this orchardist put the compost right kind of at the drip line where the irrigation is going to be most effective, and where the water will infiltrate and where the trees will pick it up. So that's a smart way to do that. And then increasing soil organic matter will help with sandy soils. You know, I've worked quite a bit taking soil samples down in Stanislaus County, which is north of you, but there's sandy soils everywhere, and well, they don't really hold soil moisture very well. So increasing organic matter, like putting in some cover crops, use of compost, chipping prunings, that will help some of these sandy soils store more water and nutrients. And well, it will also help clay soils kind of loosen up a little bit. So enough about soils. They're really important. I really feel like we haven't invested enough in soil health, and I think you'll benefit from starting to do some of that. So, end management. This is a site that the CDFA put together with the FREP, the Fertilizer Research and Education Program. It provides some pretty good guidance about what are the appropriate amounts of nitrogen and other nutrients to provide to annual crops as well as your perennial crops. So I'd encourage you to kind of take a look at this. Lots of good information in there. And this, well, this you've probably all recognized. You've been filling these out for a few years now, I'm guessing. We'll focus on the end component. And there's parts per million listed and milligrams per liter. They're the same if you're reporting on nitrate, and those are two ways to say the same thing. And the concentration of the nitrogen in your irrigation water, it can be obtained from several sources. Local district testing, if your RCD does that, you might want to just test on your own, send it into a lab for analysis. You should probably test your irrigation water a couple times per year because the nitrate concentration in your irrigation water may change over the year. Now, if you're into math or into equations, here's one way to figure out if you get a nitrate N report back from the lab, it's going to be in milligrams per liter probably. And so what you want to do is convert that to how many milligrams per gallon. So that's, you multiply that milligrams per liter or parts per million times 3.78. That's how many liters per gallon. So that'll give you milligrams nitrate per gallon. And then if you multiply times 27,154, that will give you how many gallons per acre inch. And that will essentially give you the milligrams of nitrate per acre inch. Okay. But who knows, milligrams, that's not what we use. We use like pounds or ounces, pounds per acre feet applied. So there's 453,592 milligrams per pound. So if you divide what you've gotten so far after you've multiplied times the 27,154 gallons per acre inch, if you divide that by that larger number, 453,592, that will end up giving you the N credit in pounds per acre applied. So, but there are a lot easier ways to do this. There's a lot of tables you can access on the internet. This table is quite easily used, and if you have a report from your lab that's in between, 15 and 20 or 20 and 25, you can interpolate you know, if you had, say, 17 parts per million, that's kind of right in the middle of 15 and 20. At 15 parts per million, that's in 1 inch of irrigation water, you'd have 3 pounds per acre. And at 20 parts per million, you'd have 5 parts per million. At 17 parts per million, you'd probably be right in the middle at 4 pounds of nitrogen applied per acre inch. And then the MPEP folks have developed some really nice nitrogen calculators on their website. And you can download these if you go down to that lower blue button. You can download the calculator and put it on your hard drive. And so that's what this looks like. You can put in the nitrate and analysis from the lab right here, and then how many inches of water that you're irrigating with. 2 to 4 or half an inch, whatever. It's also helpful if you have your irrigation efficiency. And that's what the speakers today are talking about. Doubtful that anybody here has 100% efficiency. You may have 90 or even 95, maybe 85. But you need to include your irrigation efficiency down in this box where there's the default is 100, but I don't think anybody has 100% efficiency here. So that is a very easy way to figure out how much nitrate you're applying or how much nitrogen you're applying. And if you have a couple different sources, they have spreadsheets for that as well. Say if you have a well water and you're using some surface irrigation water too, but you need to know the nitrate concentrations of both of those. And if for some reason there's some ammonium tends to evaporate very, very quickly. But maybe you have some ammonium in your water, and you can include that as well. So making and budget, for example, if you're using almonds, end demand for almonds, and this is applied, and then what you're removing with the almonds is about 68 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pounds of kernels. So, if you have a couple thousand pounds, your processor reports back a couple thousand pounds per acre. You have about 2 times 68, 136 pounds of nitrogen removed via the export of that crop. Keep in mind also, your trees are growing, and they're, especially if you have kind of youngish kinds of trees, say 9 to 13 and even earlier, those almond trees absorb or use up about 25 to 30 pounds per acre annually, just incorporating into their tissue. So that's something to keep in mind. Other inputs are pretty straightforward, and the way our soils are working, unless you have, say, 4 or 5% organic matter, most of your fertilizer, what you apply as chemical fertilizer, that's pretty much immediately available to the plant. But for other amendments, manure, compost, cover crops, it's not quite what you disc in or plow in or what you apply in compost. It's not going to be the amount of nitrogen that is going to be available to the plant. And so, let's see here, organic amendments, any nutrient applications from sources that do not have a guaranteed nutrient content, such as compost and manure applications, The applied organic amendments should be reported as the amount of nitrogen available to the plant during the crop year in pounds per acre. And in all of these situations, manure is, you'll get a lot more nitrogen, percentage of the nitrogen applied in manure than you would say from compost or even a cover crop. But for example, most composts have about 1% nitrogen. But I would highly recommend that you ask your compost supplier if you're applying compost. And the Healthy Soils program has a really good cost share for applying compost. They will provide 50, you can apply 6 to 8 tons of a particular carbon nitrogen ratio compost, 6 to 8 tons of compost per acre at $50 a ton. And that's a good deal. And if your soils are maybe not up to snuff, I would highly recommend you take advantage of this cost share, because it's a great deal, and they provide that for 3 years in a row. Most compost suppliers are hesitant to give you the analysis, because anything with an analysis that's sold, like an NPK analysis, is considered a fertilizer, and so it's subject to the mill tax that fertilizers are subject to in California. But most compost suppliers do have an idea. They've had their compost analyzed and can give you an idea about where that nitrogen percentage is. But as a default, use 1%. And so you might consider 5 tons an acre application. That's about 10,000 pounds. At 1%, that would provide 100 pounds, which is a fair amount of nitrogen. However, in all the reading and talking to farmers and folks that know more about this than I do, only about 15 to 20% of that compost, of that nitrogen in that 10,000 pounds of compost you applied, or that 100 pounds of applied N, only about 15 to 20% of that will be available to the plant for this cropping season. So, you'd put in your nitrogen management plan, you'd put in 15 or 20 pounds, not the 100 pounds, because that's essentially not what's available to the plant. I'll talk about what, you're building up reserves in your soil of nitrogen as well as organic matter. But, and those will be metabolized and drawn down in future cropping cycles. And the thing with chemical fertilizers versus, manure or compost or cover crops is the nitrogen in chemical fertilizers is essentially it's available to the plant. It's in a form available to the plant. All the nitrogen in these organic sources, manure, compost, and cover crops, it's attached to carbon. And so it has to be metabolized by the soil biology in order for most of it to be available to the plant. It's like slow nitrogen, I call it. Cover crops are kind of trickier. You know how much you're applying with compost, right? Or how much manure you're going to be applying. And with manure, I'd suggest you want to do a light disc. If you're applying straight manure, do a light disc to incorporate it into the ground. Otherwise, you're going to probably within just a few days of application, you're going to lose about half of the nitrogen content of that manure. So for cover crops, this is a little bit more involved, and but what I'm going to outline here is it'll give you a ballpark figure. And you're gonna have to do some sampling of your cover crop, how much biomass. You wanna figure out how much biomass and then how much dry biomass, and then guesstimate what is the percentage of nitrogen in that biomass. The way I've done this, and I've seen a lot of RCDs do this and other groups. I use a 2x2 foot square. 1 inch PVC works quite well. And then in order to get a handle on how much biomass your cover crop is putting out, you need to cut all the vegetation in that 2x2 foot square. Cut all the vegetation down at ground level. You don't rip up the roots, you just cut it at ground level as close as you can get it. You weigh that, and you want to take a few samples just to get kind of a better average. Now I take generally 3 samples because it is time consuming. It's a little bit of a pain, but the more samples you take, the better kind of average weight of the biomass you'll end up developing. So take a few samples, put them in a bag, which you've already weighed because you want to subtract the weight of the bag from that sample. So knowing you have 1 acre is 43,560 square feet. In this example, the average weight of the 3 samples I'm saying is going to be 1.5 pounds. So maybe at 1.7, 1.5, and 1.3, and it averaged out to 1.5 pounds. So the weight of 4 square feet is 1.5 pounds, and you can extrapolate that out using this equation. How many 4 square feet plots you have, essentially you divide 43,560 by 4, and that'll give you how many times you need to multiply 1.5 pounds by. So that comes out to roughly 8 tons or 16,335 pounds per acre of wet cover crop. Now that sounds like a lot until you figure like most of that, say in this cover crop picture up on the left corner there, that's pretty lush. That's in the spring. I think that was taken April, maybe April. Yeah, sometime in April. That cover crop has about 85% of that cover crop is water weight. So it's just water. So in order to get the dry weight or the weight of the dry matter portion of the cover crop, multiply times 0.15, which is the percentage of that cover that will be, after all the water is taken out. So multiply the wet biomass times 0.15, that gives you about 2,450 pounds per acre dry weight. Okay, pretty straightforward. That's like 1.25 tons of dry weight organic matter you're adding in. And a guesstimate of the percent nitrogen in this cover crop, and this is variable. If you have a straight legume cover crop, say legume and bell beans, legumes are going to have a higher percent of nitrogen, 3%, maybe up to 3.5%. If this is a mixed cover crop, there's mustards, there's a couple legumes in there that you can't see, and then there's some a small grain in there as well. So that would be kind of in the middle. I guesstimated a 2% for this cover crop. But if you have just using triticale as a cover crop, that's kind of the beginner cover crop, that might be just 1 or 1.5%, depending on the time that you chop that and perhaps disc it in. If you wait until, say, a grass is heading out, the ratio of the carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be quite a bit higher. There's going to be essentially more carbon than nitrogen, which is most often the case, but the amount of nitrogen available to help digest the carbon that you're putting into the soil is going to be perhaps insufficient. So the cover crop, if you disced in like a seed headed triticale cover, with the seed head already coming out, likely you would be using up some of the nitrogen in your soil already, and it would be a detriment to the short-term nitrogen availability. Okay, hope that's not too confusing. So I guesstimated here, this cover crop is 2%. So 0.02 times the dry weight of that cover crop is that yields about 49 pounds of nitrogen per acre from that cover crop. But once again, only about half of that cover crop will be available to the trees or to the following crop. And that's because all this stuff is linked to nitrogen, all the nitrogen is linked to carbon. And so the microbiology has to process this. So in this case, you put in the plant available nitrogen would be about 25 pounds, roughly. And here's a schematic that kind of outlines what's happening in the soils. So this top box, the whole box is how much nitrogen you're applying, either in compost or in a cover crop, but only about the blue square represents what is plant available and for that particular year. And in year 2, if you do another cover crop, well, you'll have the same situation, but from the previous year's cover crop or compost, you'll have additional nitrogen in that organic matter that has not yet been metabolized, and therefore the nitrogen that is associated with that organic matter has not yet been made available to the plants. And so if you're regularly adding organic matter to your crop, to your soils, you're building up these reserves. Now, guesstimating how much is available from the reserves, that's a trickier matter, and I won't go into that here today. Just to know that you're building up reserves of organic matter, you're creating a healthier soil, and that that will help your plants withstand some of the stresses that we're going to be heading up into. So I think Jeff had mentioned these programs already. The CDFA Healthy Soils Incentives Program, their online application will be available, I've been told, at the end of this month or early November. And they have a lot of cost share practices. They've taken a lot of the NRCS practices and just replicated them. But I think they have better cost shares, to be blunt about it. NRCS also has their EQIP. I'm not going to go into the conservation stewardship program. I think most folks probably access NRCS programs through EQIP and then graduate from EQIP into the conservation stewardship program, the CSP. But this CSP pay rates are somewhat complicated. So if you're interested, you can ask your NRCS folks. Jeff had mentioned the soil carbon practice standard. This is an interim practice standard. It's only being done by about 14 states across the country. California is one of them. This is a great cost share because you can apply biochar, you can apply compost. But again, I would say check out the CDFA cost share because I think it's a little bit better. And so with that, I'll take any questions. Hopefully I didn't confuse you too much about some of the stuff I talked about. Capturing the amount of nitrogen from organic sources is kind of tricky. Trina, any questions? Or?
Doesn't look like we have any questions online or in the room.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, my email was on the PowerPoint, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
And with that, we'll get set up for our next speakers with NRCS. I believe your folks.
I'm just gonna be speaking.
Is you? All right, well, I'll let you do the appropriate introductions then.
All right.
I don't know job titles.
No worries, no worries. Hi, my name's Scott Turner. I'm with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'm an agricultural engineer. That's Kurt Metcalf. And normally I'm much more animated than standing behind a podium, so we'll see how this works out. I normally point at the screen and dance and sing, and I guess we're gonna skip that. We figured it would just be easier for one of us to speak, so you're stuck with me. Sorry about that. So I'm gonna talk about irrigation water management. And let's see.
Stop the girl.
Just use this one? Which one? Oh, check that out. All right. This was going to be a lot longer list of discussion points, and as I was going through it, I decided to simplify it. I wanted to keep things simple for the audience. I know there's a wide range of there's some professionals here and some farmers, and so I didn't want to speak over anyone's head or get too complex. And so I'm just going to narrow it down to these two things. We've got the application rate of your irrigation system, and then we're going to get into irrigation scheduling, which Dr. Lilly actually did a very good job of. I'll be repeating some of that and using an example that we'll be going through so you can kind of see it. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the application rate. And this is your irrigation system onto your field. We can get that from two places. We can either get that from a design, if you have a design from an irrigation designer. Hopefully it's something new and something that represents what's out in the field. If the design is something from 10 or 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't use it. It might be a good start, but chances are emitters have changed out in the field. Just wear and tear on the system has probably made that design at least partially obsolete. Like I said, it's a good start, but probably not the best thing to go on. But if you have a new design, by all means, pull it out, take a look at it. We can glean a lot of information from there. The other way, of course, is getting out into the field. And so I'm going to discuss both of those. So start with the design. Once again, this is where I would point, but in the upper left-hand corner of the design there is your piping schematics. That is common on all designs. It's going to show you where pipelines are out in the field, give or take a row, the sizes, the types. This is all really good information, assuming everything went in according to the design. If there's ever a leak or a repair or you need to add to the system, there's your pipes. There will be some standard drawings, like in the lower left and the upper right. And then sometimes not, there's some charts, flow rates, set information, pressure losses like in the lower right there. And then on the far right-hand side, kind of sideways, there's a block there that has some good information in it also. Everything that you would need for calculating application rate is actually on this design that I'm showing you. And most designs now will have all of this information. I'm going to go into more detail about what we do if we had to go out to the field. And what we collect out in the field is basically all here on this piece of paper. So if you have the design and it's accurate, it really does shorten your workload. So if we have to go out into the field, we need 4 things. We need the emitter make and model. We need the pressure at the emitter. We need the number of emitters per plant, and we need the plant spacing. 3 of these are really easy to get. The pressure at the emitter is a little more difficult. This is not the pressure at the pump. This is not even necessarily the pressure at the pressure valve leading into a specific set on your system. This is what is actually happening right there at the emitter. There is pressure gauges that you can use that have a pitot tube. You can poke a little hole in the drip tubing and get it on in there to get a pressure at that specific location. Sometimes flush outs have a Schrader valve on it that you can, just like checking the tire pressure on your car, you can measure pressure for your irrigation system that way. But you want to get it as close to the emitter as possible. It's going to get you the most accurate information. So for our example, we're going to say that we went out to the field and we collected this information. The crop is almonds. The spacing is 18 by 21. The emitter is a Bosmith Fanjet number 40 blue nozzle. It's going to be very common in this area. Pressure 20 psi, and there's 1 emitter per tree, or one microsecond per tree. Go online, and this is what the manufacturer specifications look like. It's a great chart, has all kinds of great information in it. Starting with the gray nozzles and working down to the red. The nozzle size increases, therefore your flow increases. And we are going to be looking right in here because we're interested in the blue nozzle and those first couple of columns. And so I've highlighted that and brought that forward here. Those columns, the headers at the top were nozzle size there on the left, pressure in PSI, flow in gallons per hour. That's important. Make sure that when you're looking at the manufacturer specifications, if that's in gallons per hour or gallons per minute, definitely makes a difference. Some of your larger Nelsons, like your R series and stuff, will be listed in gallons per minute. So make sure you get that right. And then diameter. The way these fan jets operate, they have streams of water, and one stream shoots longer, the next stream shoots shorter, the next stream shoots longer, the next stream shorter. And that's just to improve your water distribution for that one particular sprinkler. And so we list the diameters there. And so what once again, what we're interested in here is the pressure and the flow, 20 PSI and 10.7 gallons per hour. And so we went out in the field, we've collected these 4 things. Here is what we've collected, and why we need the emitter make and model and the pressure is because we really need that flow. We need that 10.7 gallons per hour. If you go back, let's see, we'll go back a couple here. If you look at the other pressures on this list, 15 PSI gives you 9.3 gallons per hour, and if we were a little higher, 25, that's 12 gallons per hour. This is very common with emitters, whether they're drippers or microspray, is as the pressure goes up, the flow goes up. It's not necessarily linear. There are pressure compensating emitters that between a range, say 10 PSI and 50 PSI, it's kind of common. They would throw out a constant flow. They're a little more money, and there's definitely applications where you would want to use it if there's some elevation changes, or you have some long runs where you might have a lot of pressure loss along a run. pressure compensating emitters are definitely a good way to go. But like I said, they're a little more money. So most people will go with the non-pressure compensating and just aim for a pressure. And so I just wanted to point that out. So knowing the make and model and the pressure, we get the flow of 10.7 gallons per hour. 1 emitter per tree, we got the spacing, and then we're gonna get into a little math. I promise you this will be the most complicated math of the day, at least in my talk. The application rate in inches per hour, which is a very common measurement, is 96.3 times the flow rate times emitters per tree divided by the irrigated area. The 96.3 is just a constant that converts gallons per minute and square feet into inches per hour. Won't go through the math, but trust me on that one. Some guy said 96.3, that's easy to remember because that's Cub Country. I'm like, all right, whatever gets you to remember it. So in this formula, the flow rate has to be gallons per minute. So we had 10.7 gallons per hour. We have to change that to gallons per minute, so we divide by 60, and we get 0.178 gallons per minute. The irrigated area, I'm going to use the tree spacing. Not all emitters or microsprays cover the entire footprint of the tree, but the application rate, as long as the soil can take it in, it basically is for that tree. So I'm going to use the whole area in this example. So we're going to use the 18 by 21, which is 378 square feet. And so we do the math and we get 0.045 inches per hour. All of this is real life stuff. This could be probably dozens of orchards in the Atwater Livingston area. It's a very common sprinkler that I used, very common spacing. And so this application rate of 0.045 is very common. It's going to be 0.0 something. It's a very small number. Go and put that in terms, there's an inch, a tenth of an inch, and it's half of that. So it's just a little bit over the 18 by 21 in an hour. And if you think about it, it's 10.7 gallons, so a couple 5-gallon buckets of water that you dumped out. If the water didn't soak in right away, if you dumped it out over that 18 by 21 foot area, it'd be really, really small. So that all makes sense. All these numbers seem to be lining up. All right, there's another way we can calculate application rate, and once you try it on a per tree basis, that's probably a little more accurate. Then we can do it on a whole farm basis. And there's two ways we can do that. We can do that either using the field acreage, and I'm talking about irrigated acreage, so don't look at your APN acreage because that's going to include roads and everything else. You want to do just the acreage that is irrigated. If you have maps from the Farm Service Agency, their acreage is really pretty good. That would be a good thing. So just because the APN says 20 acres, it's like, oh, I got that shop. How big is that shop? I'm not really sure. If you have an FSA map, they will tell you acres. The other way is a lot of farmers know the number of trees they have. And so as long as you're close, the more accurate you can get on one of those numbers, the better using this method will be. So if you look at the formula up at top there, it's a little bit shorter. It's the 96.3 again, flow rate in gallons per minute, and we're going to get that reading from the flow meter, and then we're divided by the irrigated area. So the reading from the flow meter is what is going through the flow meter as you're irrigating. It'll be measured in gallons per minute normally. If you don't have a flow meter, like Dr. Lee said, definitely get one. They are invaluable as far as information you get. The two common readings you get is an instantaneous reading, what's going through that flow meter right now. That's what we're looking for in this formula. And then there's also like a totalizer, like an odometer on your car, how much has gone through for an irrigation or a season. The electronic ones can be reset. I know guys that have the little spiral notebook right here, and every irrigation they're writing down a beginning and an ending number, so that you have not only what's going on to the field right now in gallons per minute, as was mentioned earlier, that should be close to what your design says, and if it's not one way or the other, there's usually a problem. But also you could say, okay, I've got so many acres, I applied so many acre inches, I put on, 3 inches of water this irrigation, is that what I wanted to put on? Oh man, that's more than I was thinking, or that's less than I was thinking. Flow meters give you great information. Get yourself a flow meter if you don't have one. NRCS will cost share on those. It's not, our cost share program, we always have a lot more applications for money than we have money available, so it is competitive, but it is something you can apply for, and if you don't have one, talk to us. Okay, back to this. The flow rate gallons per minute, and we'll do the field acreage first. And so, once again, we have almonds, 20 acres of field, and I put 20.0 there because you probably want to get a decimal point to get this as accurate as possible. 2,300 trees spaced at 18 by 21, flow meter reading at 400 gallons a minute. We go through the math, and once again, that irrigated area has to be in square feet. So if we're putting acres in there, then we're going to need to multiply by 43560 to get into square feet. On the bottom there, irrigated acres, irrigated area in acres, try to be as accurate as possible on that. So the application rate, we're going through the math here, 96.3 times 400 gallons a minute, divided by 20, divided by 43560, gives us an application rate of 0.44 inches per hour. And matches up pretty close to what we came up to before. If that number is wildly different, check both methods and see where the error is. Those should be really, really close. 4.4 and 4.5 are very close. If you came up with 0.06 or 0.07, one of the two is wrong. And so once again, look at your flow meter. Is that reading correctly? Sometimes, honestly, flow meters, once they're put in correctly, they're great. Some guys will try to squeeze them into a really tight area, and that can lower the efficiency of your flow meter. Some people put them in backwards, I've seen that, then you're gonna get all kinds of funky answers. So make sure they're put in correctly and to manufacturer specifications. Usually there's a certain number of diameters upstream and a certain number of diameters downstream that they want, like straight flow, to get more accurate readings. So you want to compare those two numbers, they should be close. And then real quickly, I'll go through the number of trees, kind of the same idea, but for irrigated area, we're going to use the number of trees times the tree spacing. And so we got the 96.3 times 400 gallons a minute again, divided by 2,300 trees, times the 18 by 21, and we get 0.044 again. So to do that math in a calculator, and I'm not trying to be pejorative to anyone here, but just in case someone doesn't know, you can do that a couple ways. You can do the 96.3 times 400 and put it off to the right there. You can do the 2,300 times 18 times 21, put that off to the right there, and then divide those two numbers. That's fine. Or if you just want to just keep punching numbers into your calculator, it would be 96.3 times 400 equals, divided by 2,300 equals, divided by 18 equals, divided by 21 equals. Either one of those answers will get you, or either one of those methods will get you the right answer. All right, before we get into scheduling, any questions so far? I'm a little ahead of time, but that's okay because no one wants to be late for lunch. No questions? All right, moving on to irrigation scheduling. All right, so So I'm gonna talk a little bit about evapotranspiration, and some of this has been mentioned earlier, but there's no point, there's no harm in reiterating this. Evapotranspiration is the water loss from the plant plus the water loss through evaporation from the soil. It's both of those together. And so as you're applying water to the soil, we need both of those as it's exiting the soil so we know what to replace. What affects that, the four, like kind of around the corners here, the major things that affect that: the solar radiance from the sun, the lower right there, temperature, of course, the upper right, wind. That has a dramatic effect. For anyone who's ever grown crops, wind, like on the west side where it's a lot windier, definitely affects your crops. And then humidity, which we don't have too much of an issue here in California, but in other areas, humidity does play a part. The other thing would be rainfall, but since it's California, it's not even included on this drawing. And during the normal growing season, we don't have a whole lot of rainfall anyway, so. You saw this earlier. This is a typical CIMMYS weather station. It measures things like temperature and humidity, wind speed and wind direction, solar radiance, soil temperature, precipitation, evaporation, probably a couple others I've forgotten. And that big white box there on the side of it is a data collector. It collects all that data hourly, every day of the year. Every night that information is collected by Department of Water Resources, and the data is verified to make sure there isn't any anomalies one way or the other. If there is, they just kind of throw out that data for the year or for the day. And it's posted on the CIMMYS website. And like it was mentioned earlier, there's 100 plus stations throughout California. There's 3 here in Merced County, 1 on the east side here in Merced, 2 on the west side, Los Banos, Castro City, I think is the other one. These give us great information. I'll just read this here. A typical weather station. Weather stations measure and record several weather data points. Evapotranspiration is calculated using this data. A properly installed weather station is set over tall fescue, and so evapotranspiration calculated is for a tall fescue crop, and that's ETO, or the reference evapotranspiration. To convert this evapotranspiration number into something usable for your crop, ETC, a crop coefficient is applied. And you've seen this one before. ETO times crop coefficient gives you ETC. If nothing else, look at that ETO. There are some crops that use a significant amount more than that, and you'll see that, I guess, in the stress if you're following that ETO exactly, but you will at least start to gain a pattern and know that, hey, I need to do a certain percentage over that. And what you will be doing really is kind of calculating your own crop coefficient, because that's what the crop coefficient does, is it says, here's the reference for grass, but I've got almonds, so I need to multiply it by 1.1 or 1.15, 1.17. That number is getting larger and larger as we move on here. So a little talk on crop coefficients. There's no one published list because crop coefficients change with crop type, age of crop, time of year, and location of the field. Everything could be exactly the same, but things down in Bakersfield are going to be different than Merced, and they're going to be different than Sacramento, even if the tree and the soil and everything is exactly the same, because of weather patterns. And so it's really hard to tie down exactly what to use. Cal Poly San Luis Obispo has a really good set of tables. They're a good place to start. There's a couple other references online. We at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, we have a list of some crop coefficients. We usually deal more with peak ET for your crop, which is what you'd be concerned with the design. We'll get to that in a minute. As far as crop coefficients over the year, whether it's a crop planted annually or something perennial like trees, you'd probably want to go to Cooperative Extension or check out the Cal Poly website. Many experts in the field disagree slightly on KC values. It's another reason they're kind of hard to nail down. There's some of us here in Merced County that still kind of banter back and forth. Is it this? Is it that? I would highly recommend that you use newer crop coefficient values, probably within the last 10 years. Older crop coefficient values are probably underestimating your peak ET due to the planet heating up. And then don't under-design your system because you have chosen a lower peak ETC to save a few bucks on the cost of parts and installation. An irrigation system only degrades as time goes on. Build in as many factors of safety as you can. I have had irrigation designers come to me and say, I want to use a lower ET because the pipe size, I can go down this pipe size, or we can use one less set or something like that. And the day you put in your irrigation system and fire it up for the first time, maybe the second time after you get the bugs out, is the best that irrigation system will ever work. It will only degrade and get worse from that point on, just through wear and tear. Nozzle sizes will change either through calcification of water deposits or sand going through, fine sand going through plastic nozzles is just like a sandblaster. Eventually it'll make those nozzles wider. Wear and tear on the pump over 5 years is going to degrade and efficiency is going to go down. So you don't want to shortchange things up front and make it just so razor thin that you're right there, because next year it may not be as efficient as you want it to be. So build in the factors of safety up front, and crop coefficient is an easy one. Make your peak ET a little bit higher than maybe at least pick the highest value of the several that you've looked at. So for irrigation scheduling in a daily runtime, we're going to use this information. Almonds in Merced County, a peak ET of 0.32 inches per day, which is what we use at NRCS. We use the application rate that we calculated earlier at 0.045 inches per hour and a distribution uniformity of 90%. I'm going to talk just a bit about distribution uniformity here. It's been mentioned earlier. There's distribution uniformity and there's irrigation efficiency, and they're often said interchangeably, but they're not interchangeable. Distribution uniformity is how evenly water is getting to your crop. So if the pressures, remember I said pressure and flow, as the pressure goes up, the flow goes up in a lot of these emitters. So maybe the first emitters that the pump gets to, where the pressure is high, you're getting more flow. And maybe way at the far end of the field, you're getting less flow because the pressure's gone down there, just as water's moving through the system. And so the difference, the variation in that is distribution uniformity. If you could get every tree the exact same amount of water every time, that's 100% distribution uniformity. Nobody has that. For drip systems, right off the bat, they're probably 92 to 94% efficient nowadays. Or sorry, DU with DU. I use 90 because, like I said, it gets less over time. But the drip systems are really good. Sprinklers are probably 85 to 90%. Flood irrigation, depending on how much control you have over your flood water and how well you watch your flood water, can't be as high as 75 or 80%, but generally it's 55 to 60% on flood irrigating. Basically because as soon as you start irrigating the front end of the field, or top end of the field, water's already infiltrating there and it hasn't got to the other end of the field for 8 hours down the road. So you got 8 hours of infiltration here when this one's getting its first drop. And so distribution uniformity on flood systems is generally pretty low. But on pressurized systems, it is higher. I use about 90%. Irrigation efficiency is, now that we've made the distribution uniformity as tight as we can be, how much water did we apply to the crop and how much water did the crop need? So if the crop needed 6 inches of water and you applied 2 inches of water, your irrigation efficiency is terrible. So one is how even and one is how much compared to what the crop needs. That's the difference between the two. Basically, everything we've been talking about today throughout the day has been, I think everything, has been distribution. So we're gonna use just 90% distribution uniformity for our scheduling example here. And so we have peak ETC. Once again, that's the peak. That's when the crop is mature. That is the hottest time of the year. Usually in this area, August. And it is the ETO times the crop coefficient. So it is actually specific to your crop. The peak ET divided by the application rate times the DU. So the runtime here is equal to 0.32 inches per day divided by the 0.045 inches per hour and the 0.9 distribution uniformity, and we get 7.9 or about 8 hours per day. This is if you are irrigating every single day. You are going to need to put on 8 inches to replace that day's worth of evapotranspiration. If you irrigate every day, great, run it for 8 hours in your cover during the hot part of the year. If you want to stay off peak, you probably need to irrigate at least every other day and run it for 16 hours, and then you can stay off peak. If you don't care, then it depends about the peak, about staying off peak. If you don't care about that, then it depends on what your soil can hold. And I don't want to get into that right now. Actually, we have a little more time, but I don't have any slides for that because I didn't think I'd have the time. But if your soils can hold in the root zone, in what you want to manage in that root zone, if they can hold 3 inches of water, then if it were full during the peak ET using 0.32 inches per day, that's about 9 days, and it would deplete what you're managing. So every 9 days, at least at the minimum, you would have to irrigate. And then you would have to irrigate for 9 times 8 hours, or 72 hours, to replace that water. Most people don't want to go that long, especially with the drip system. They usually do twice a week, probably. So you're probably depleting an inch worth of water and applying an inch worth of water. So in this example, every 3 days you irrigate for 24 hours. It's very common in this area. All this example, and it's all in your sheets there, is very common for this area. And I wanted to pick something common. I wanted to pick something that you could take home and, hey, I got this, I'm gonna do it myself. And if you have any questions or any, need help with that, or you want to explore this more, Kurt and I are available to discuss this with you guys more. And so that's all I have. I'm way early, that's fine. Does anyone have any questions or anything more you want to talk about? I didn't get into the soil moisture sensors because, well, one, I didn't think I had the time, and two, it's another 45 or hour long conversation if we want to do it right. It is something that we support at NRCS. It is something we cost share at NRCS. We have an irrigation water management cost share available to you guys, and there's a couple different levels of that. There's kind of an intermediate level and an advanced level, and that's something that we can discuss with you. We could use soil moisture sensors with that. We can use this ET-based approach with that. There will be lots of record keeping on your part. There will be a graph that you guys would have to develop that shows soil moisture depleting, and then you irrigate back up, and then soil moisture depleting, and you irrigate back up. But that's all stuff that we can definitely guide you through if that's what you want to dive into. It's the next step basically in, like, I don't want to irrigate every Tuesday because my dad irrigated every Tuesday, my grandpa irrigated every Tuesday. So it's like, all right, I want to be intentional with my irrigation. And I want to be sensitive to what the crop needs during certain times of the year, and every drop of water I apply costs me money. So I want to make sure that every drop counts. And we're not over irrigating, getting below the root zone. We're not pushing our nutrients down. We're not wasting water that way. We are just applying to the crop what it needs. So, I'll open up to any questions. Anybody have any questions? No. All right. Give everybody lunch. Thanks, guys.
So we finished a little bit early. We're supposed to be back at 12:15 for lunch, but we'll try to be back around 12:10 and we can get out of here earlier. Lunch is in the back for those of you in person. Online, you can. Hi everyone. We're gonna meet back in a couple minutes, so just prepare, finish up your chewing, or you can still eat while you're watching though. For online people, yeah, we'll be back around 12 to 12. We'll get 12 to 12. Oh, it's earlier actually. Here than my lunch. Yeah. We'll do 12 10.
Did you order gypsum yet? Not yet. You told me it's a 3 or 4 week. Yeah, I know. I'm scheduled for somewhere in the middle of November. I don't know whether it's gonna be raining or snowing. This year, everything is just short supply.
Let me know when you have ready. It's just you listening and then I'm driving up. No, they probably do
Hold on one second.
That's right. Strap down everything. Get the door stuck.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from lunch. Hope you guys got lots of good snacks. My name is Riley Durham. I am an irrigation specialist as well as an agricultural conservationist with East Stanislaus Resource Conservation and the Modesto NRC. Yes. I've been with them for the last 3 years doing distribution uniformities up and down the state. So I've got a little bit of experience on my belt when it comes to how irrigation systems should be working versus how probably should be working. So today we're just going to go over some maintenance topics, some tips, some tricks, what to do, what not to do. And then if you guys have questions, we'll save some time for the end. Otherwise, we'll get started. All right. So, irrigation systems, why is it important to maintain? Well, first of all, whether it was you who put it in or your grandpa or whoever it was, that was a hefty investment. And we need to protect our investments and treat them right to make sure that they're going to be working properly for as long as possible. So just making sure that when we, or whoever put it in, remember that was a lot of money and we need to protect that. Think about it, your vehicle. You wouldn't bypass changing the oil or changing your filters and making sure its fluids are correct, NOx levels, what have you. So just making sure that you're treating it and making sure it's operating as it should be. And kind of piggybacking off of that, it also helps you maintain your warranties. A lot of this stuff when we do with maintenance, it's preventative, it's making sure we're doing things before the big problems happen. And a lot of the big problems that we come across are preventable. So if we are able to do our maintenance properly, making sure everything's up to date, up to code, whatever, it'll usually coincide with your warranties to make sure they're active for however long they're active for. And we don't want to do something that's going to void those warranties, because when the thing happens that was completely out of our control, then we're going to be paying out of pocket for things like that. So just making sure that we're being proactive with our maintenance and preventing those hefty costs in the future. And one thing that we can do at the beginning of our system, especially a new system, is to kind of create a baseline for what we're going to use in the future. And the way we can do this is distribution uniformity testing. We've mentioned that today already, and I'll go a little bit more in depth, but not too crazy. It's basically giving us some information to say, okay, how accurate is my system working? What are my trees truly receiving from our irrigation system? So my recommendation to everybody, whoever puts a new system in, as soon as possible, get that distribution uniformity test so we have that baseline, we have that data for the future. So if something goes haywire, we can review back, we can look at our logbook and decide, okay, this is what it was a year ago, it is way low right now, what are we going to do to fix it? So gathering this information is really just a good way to keep yourself prepared for the future. All right, and then I kind of already discussed, but distribution uniformity testing, basically what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of pressures, a bunch of flows, we're getting that, the way that they coincide with each other, we're using that to come up with our information. So like we talked about previously, a good range that I like to see when I'm doing distribution uniformity testing is about that in between of 85 and 95%. And that's pretty typical with newer systems. With older systems, wear and tear, I've seen as low as 30 to 40%, and that was super, super low, and we found solutions to mediate that. So it's just a good baseline to keep yourself aware of what's going on, and it's really helpful, especially if you need a quick solution to what you're looking at. All right, so the rest of the presentation, I'm going to kind of go in it as the time of year versus where your water is coming from and where is it going. So in terms of your filter station and the pre-season maintenance that we need to take care of, is making sure that we're starting up our system before we actually need to irrigate. So then it gives us time to do any necessary repairs, it gives us time to work out the kinks in case something went wrong over the winter. And so we just need to make sure that we are cleaning, we are disassembling, we are doing anything and everything to make sure that all of our components are working cohesively and efficiently. And whether you have a vacuum filter, whether you have media filters, it applies to everything. You need to make sure that we're doing that in order to make sure that the rest of the season is working smoothly. And that goes in hand with all of your electrical components. As time goes on, things are getting a lot more technological. We're using a lot more fancy kind of cool things, which is really awesome. Technology can help us, but at the same time, technology can also bite us in the butt if it's not working properly. So we want to make sure that any type of our VFDs, a variable frequency drive, our meters, our gauges, everything's being calibrated properly, whether that's somebody coming out to calibrate it for us or we're sending it off. Sometimes when you're looking at our warranties, some of those warranty qualifications needs to be calibrated every year. So make sure we're getting that material calibrated, working properly, and so that it's not going to bite us in the butt in the future. You can see the flow meter, it's not working right, we're not going to have the right data, and then we're not going to know what happens when things go wrong. So we're going to make sure that that information is correct, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're getting the right information for the future. All right. So moving on to our hose lines, this is one of the biggest problems that I come across in terms of when I go out and look at an irrigation system. There is going to be damage, there are going to be things that happen, it's life, it's wear and tear, those hoses aren't permanent fixes on your system. So my best recommendation when it comes to checking out leaks, making sure they don't get worse than they need to be, is doing a visual inspection. It is so very important. A year ago, I came across an irrigation system where the hose was completely chewed in half and it looked like New Maloney's was in this guy's backyard. It was awful. So I don't know how long that was going. I knew he was on a 48-hour set. So as far as I know, that thing could have been running for 24 hours before I saw it. And that was a huge surprise to him. So just making sure we're doing our visual inspections, making sure that we've got these things under control. You can see the second picture from the left. That's an example. That one we caught early, but that is a huge water loss in the current state of affairs right now. We need to save every single drop that we can. So just making sure that we're looking for those things in terms of making sure critters and such don't do that to our system. There's not much you can do other than sitting out there and watching and running at them when they come to see it, but that's not always realistic, so we need to make sure, if possible, we could put a bucket of water out there, make it easier for the thing, or set traps if it's really that big of an issue, but a lot of this type of maintenance is going to be some making sure once it happens, we get to it quickly so that it doesn't get worse. And then also, it's not on this slide, but I will mention it. When it comes to fixing the smaller leaks or holes in our systems, let's make sure that we're using the proper equipment to plug those holes. It's very important not to use biological materials to plug a hose. I've seen sticks before, and like we know, what rots when it gets wet, you've got a bigger hole than what you started with, and now you got to replace the whole hose line. So just remember, keep the design exactly the way that the designer intended it. Don't put anything in there that shouldn't be, and you should be good to go for quite a while. Those goof plugs are super cheap. You get like 500 of them on Amazon for $50. Keep them in your pocket when you go check. Keep them in your truck, side by side, whatever you take. Grab pliers and wherever you see those holes, you can get out in the long run. And you're not going to have that pressure variation that you sometimes get if you have huge leaks. Okay, mineral plugging. This is really important, and it kind of goes with our next slide that we're going to talk about as well. There are three types of plugging that I typically see most often. There's the biological, the particulate matter, and then there's the chemical precipitates. Biological is the most often I see, whether that's algae. I have seen things such as ants and drip emitters. It gets dry during that season when we're not watering. Those ants need a dry place to hang out, and I have seen entire hoses blocked by ants. So it's very important to, again, visually assess what our system's doing, and if we need to find some way to get those from crawling into our system, we need to figure that out. Whether that be a chemical wash, whether that be making sure that they're not crawling in the first place, doing anything, we have to make sure that we're not putting that kind of thing in there. And our filtration is a big deal when it comes to particulate matter. We need to make sure we're flushing our hose regularly, especially if we've got surface water and super sandy soil. We're going to have all that running through there, and there's not going to be much we can do besides making sure our hoses are clean, because that material has to go somewhere, whether that be flusher hoses or whether that be you do not flush your hoses and it all finds its way to the sprinkler, it's all clogged up and now you can't use it. So just making sure we're using our proper filtration before it even gets to the hose, but once you get to the hose, make sure that you're flushing it because it will happen. Other things like chemical precipitates, calcium builds up very often. I've seen that. So if we use chlorine or acid to flush our hoses, we typically have less calcium buildup, and then we don't want that. So making sure we're checking, visually observing. Again, we want to be proactive. We don't want to run through our orchard and replace all of our sprinklers because we've got buildup in them. So everything kind of goes together. So just making sure we're doing that. Testing our pressures. This one I'm going to skip for right now. One of my most important and absolute biggest things that I mention to everybody that I come across is you need to flush your hoses. This is one of the best ways that we can prevent major damage to our emitters. Like I said, material has to go somewhere, and if it's not being flushed out at the ends of your hose, it's gonna find its way through those sprinklers. I usually recommend, depending on how clean or dirty your water is, in between 2 and 3 weeks. If it looks like we're doing it too often, let's take it down to 1 week every flush, in between every flush. I have come across quite a few people who say, oh yeah, I flush my hoses every week, and then I've got sludge coming out the ends of their hoses. Now this isn't to say that I don't trust you, but if you do have people working for you, I've come across that as well, and they say they're flushing their hoses, but I can tell they didn't. That opens it up for a conversation on how can we make this better. So if you come across those scenarios, have a conversation with your helper, have a conversation with your manager, make sure these things are getting done. You want to make sure everybody's time is being used valuably, making sure that everybody's money is being used properly. Let's just make sure everybody's honest, because that is another huge issue that I come across, is they say they've done these things and then it's not getting done. So making sure do flush your hoses. I will preach it till the sun goes down and the cows come home, because that is one of the best ways that we can prevent damage to our hoses. They do have automatic flush devices, which I have seen. But again, with new technology comes problems, things still get stuck in there. I always recommend the good old taking that hose end open, letting it go until you see clear water and you're good to go. I've never seen any problems with that. It usually gets the job done. All right, so now that we agree we're flushing our hoses, we're gonna go back to this one. This kind of goes hand in hand with our distribution uniformity testing. Checking our pressures is a part of that. When we do our distribution uniformity test, we take 60 pressures. We start with our hydraulically closest to the pump and filter station, and then we do our hydraulically furthest from the pump and filter station. We usually use this in order to decide, okay, where are we going to take our flow measurements? We take our flows where it's our highest pressure consecutively, and our lowest pressure, and then one in between. That gives us an idea of how well our emitters are working. Like we were talking about earlier, some people have pressure compensating emitters. If we have a pressure that is way low below our rating, then our emitters aren't going to engage, and we're not going to have properly working emitters. So it's very important to make sure we know what our pressure is looking like, so that our sprinklers can use that to its advantage and work exactly how it's supposed to. And again, we want to make sure that our holes that we use to take our pressures are being filled with goof plugs only. I've already stated why that's so important. But other than that, we want to make sure that it's working properly and that we don't have an issue somewhere else. All right, and then post-season, this is usually about the same as our preseason. We're doing a checkup, see how good our system's looking at the end of a season. We want to make sure that we're draining and cleaning our tanks. If there's a man door on our big media filters, we're opening them up. We're checking that sand if we have sand. We're going to inspect for any wear or tear, if there's things in there. We typically like to see replacing our sand every 3 to 5 years, depending on how dirty or rounded out our sand is. We want to make sure that that's being replaced. I've heard people say, well, we have to replace our sand. Yeah, it needs to be replaced, so that's very important. And then your screen and disc filters, clean them, inspect them. If they need to be replaced, replace them. Pretty easy, and then most of the pre-season maintenance applies to the end, making sure that everything's in working order before you shut it down. All right, to summarize, we have talked about why our system is important to maintain. It was a hefty investment. We want to treat it right. We want to watch for irregularities, making sure that if there's something wrong, let's do some testing, let's do some research, let's go back to our logbook, let's make sure that our pressures aren't way off base and we've got something going. And then just maintain your system, use the appropriate measures in order to do so, making sure that everything's working and coming full circle, and we're not going to end up regretting a decision we made in the past. So keep it for the design, make sure that we're working properly, maintaining that system, getting it tested if you need to get it tested. I do offer distribution uniformity testing. We've been up and down the state, as far down as Tulare, as far up as, where did we go? I think Lodi. So if you guys are interested, please let me know. If anything, it's just a good time to get an in-depth look at your system, whether you put it in 5 years ago or 20 years ago. We're more than willing to come out. I will put my contact information up here. It's pretty simple. We'll come out in the morning, take a couple hours, check it out, give you an extensive report as to what we found. We'll give you some recommendations, some possible issues that you might have, and then we'll have a discussion with you. We'll see what you learn, see what you would like to improve on, and then we'll touch bases with you, see if you want another one, to see if the implementations you made have made a difference. Completely free to you guys. I know that's a big selling point. It's free. So if you're interested, let me know. Otherwise, if you have any questions, I'll be more than willing to ask or answer them. If not, I'll be hanging around. We can have a conversation, see what you guys are doing. Cool. Thank you. I appreciate you guys' time. So that's it for today. The purpose of this was hopefully you got information out of it. And if you have any lasting questions, we are available through the plentiful amount of emails you got throughout this program this morning. So yeah, thank you. And I'll be sending out a follow-up email by next week with all the information, the certificate, and a few resources left from this workshop. So yeah, thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
You still ride your bike? You know, my daughter's Christmas is Saturday, when he gets to see a lot of mine, he got his final license, he goes to Jersey, going there in Sacramento. But he really good pilot, he got Air Force Academy, that's where he started his college right now, he just started. Yeah, he got started, he got took it to